no other name. My heart surrendered to no other reign. I will bow at no other throne. Rest my heart at no other home. Let these hands have no other crown. Let these knees fall on no other ground. Draw these eyes from the gold that won't shine. You turn this life from water to wine. Oh, I tremble, I tremble in your presence, in your presence. You take my breath with every starry night. Show your power in downtown city lights. You are higher than the top.
It's the truth.
Now you're on.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. And if you're joining us online, we're really glad that you are streaming this and joining us in that way as well. My name is Bill Gorman. I'm one of the pastors here at Christ Community and lead our Brookside campus. I also serve as a chaplain with the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. And so it's really a joy to be able to host this human trafficking training center event. And before we get started with kind of the formal part of the presentation, in a moment, I'm going to introduce Jason Cooley with KCPD to kind of walk us through our day and introduce our speakers and the people who will be leading us through that. But just a couple of just hospitality things, and just so you kind of get some framework for where we're at in the space. We have plenty of refreshments. Sorry for those of you online, we don't have virtual refreshments, but if you're here in person, we have coffee, donuts, juice, some granola bars, fruit, that kind of thing back there. Feel free at any point to hop up and grab more snacks. You're welcome to have that food and drink in here, so feel free to bring your coffee to the pew and that kind of thing. It's always a question we get, can I bring my coffee in here? Absolutely. We have had lots of coffee spills in this carpet, and we know how to clean them up. So bring your coffee, bring your snacks in here, enjoy that. There are men's restrooms out the doorway and down the stairs on this side, women's restrooms out the door and down the stairs on this side. Also, there are restrooms back through these doors as well. So again, feel free if you need those at any point, just to hop up and grab them. And yeah, so that's I think all the kind of housekeeping, logistical stuff as we begin. I'm really, really excited to be hosting this event and having the opportunity to learn more about how we can be a part of recognizing and helping to end what I think is one of the greatest evils, not only in our world and country, but right here in Kansas City. And so excited to be able to take strides in learning that. And it's such an appropriate thing that this would be in a church, because the church at its best throughout its history has always been about setting the captives free, about bringing liberty and life and freedom to image bearers. And so with that, I'm going to invite Officer Jason Cooley to come and introduce our speakers and kind of walk us through our time today. So Jason, come on up.
Thanks, buddy. Thank you, Chaplain Gorman. I'm so glad that he handled the housekeeping issues, because, believe it or not, my whole life I've spent born and raised here in Kansas City, Missouri, and this is my very first time inside this beautiful church. It's amazing. Those of you that are tuning in virtually, it does not do it justice. You should come in person sometime. This building is amazing. It's gorgeous. So thank you all for joining us, those of you that showed up to enjoy some cop fruit, a.k.a. donuts, with us in person, and also those tuning in virtually for this training. Very, very important training, these trends, these times that we are in. Also coming together with us to celebrate National Faith in Blue Weekend. This is a national celebrated event. 2,000 events across the nation are happening today through hundreds of law enforcement agencies, being coordinated through Movement Forward, Inc. down in Atlanta, Georgia. So great stuff. A lot of events going on in Kansas City with KCPD, engagements with our faith communities and our regular communities, of course, police department. 10 different events taking shape. Most of them are coming together and around food and good times and bounce houses and prayer breakfasts and those types of things. But KCPD and the chaplain program, the KCPD chaplain program, wanted to also offer up a training to the community to kind of have an effort to bring in some education and information that's very valuable to a very important topic that we're all dealing with in our communities. So with that being said, I'm not going to take up any more time, but I do want to take the opportunity to introduce our speakers today. First is Mr. Dan Nash. He is retired with the Missouri State Highway Patrol. When he was with them, he was assigned to the trafficking unit created with the Special Victims methodology. And then Allison Phillips, whom I met through a good friend, Osco Bolton, in the community. We got some great work done together one day at a coffee shop, if I recall correctly. But she's formerly with the Missouri State Attorney General's Office, director of the Human Trafficking Task Force, and former adjunct professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And then Megan is right here, and she's one of our peer support specialists that's also here today to support the effort. So with all that being said, we can't thank you guys enough for your time and coming to provide this training and work with KCPD, work with our faith communities, and try to see what we can do to make Kansas City a better place. Thank you so much.
This church. It's beautiful in here. I actually just got off a plane yesterday where I was in Idaho teaching, and honestly, this is way better than where I was teaching at in Idaho. So kudos to Kansas City, and thanks to the Kansas City Police Department for inviting us and the church for having us here. So I want to go back about 12 years ago and give you a little scenario. So I'm standing on this parking lot, and I had an interest in human trafficking, but unfortunately I didn't have any training in human trafficking. I didn't really know, honestly, even kind of what human trafficking was. And unfortunately, that's the state of law enforcement. About 17% of law enforcement officers across the country have human trafficking training. So a lot of times we're just kind of flying by the seat of our pants trying to figure out what we're doing when it comes to human trafficking. So I'm on this parking lot, and I'm with this young lady. She's about 20, and there's an older man with her, and he's in his late 30s, and I'm thinking there's something not right here. And I'm doing exactly what I was trained to do in law enforcement. I separate the parties, and I'm talking to them, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And the more that I'm talking to this young lady, the more angry she's getting at me. The more kind of choice profanity she's using toward me. The more she's not being cooperative, the more I'm trying to be nice to her, the more I'm trying to figure out what's going on, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm trying to help her, and it's not really working. And I'm getting more and more frustrated because I don't know what to do. I'm thinking I can get these, murderers to tell me about people that they killed, but I can't get this 20-year-old girl to tell me what's going on in her life so that I can help her. And I'm getting more frustrated and more frustrated and more frustrated, until finally I get to a point where I'm like, okay, and I release both of them from the contact, and off they go. And a couple months later, I get a phone call from local police department who says, hey, do you know this girl? And I'm like, yeah, I do. And they're like, yeah, we just found her in one of these rent-by-the-week hotels, and she's laying in the bathtub dead. And she slit both her wrists and bled to death in this bathtub. And on the lip of the bathtub, there was a photo of a small boy. And we tracked down her mother so that we could make notification to her mother about what had happened to her. And the mother told us that this little girl was molested by a neighbor when she was 7, all the way until she was 10. And the little girl never told anybody until she was in high school. But by that time, she'd already had all this trauma that she was dealing with, and she wasn't doing well in school, and she got mixed up with the wrong crowd, and she started dating older men. She started using drugs and alcohol. Eventually, she quits school, and she runs away. And the mom said, I didn't see her for 2 years. Until one day, I get a call from social services that says, hey, are you the mother of Jane Doe? And she's like, yeah, I am. And they're like, well, she's at the hospital, and she just gave birth to a little boy. Unfortunately, the little boy tested positive for methamphetamine. So we need to take the little boy away and put the little boy somewhere safe, and we're hoping that we can place this little boy with you. And she's like, well, of course, and I'll come right down there. So she goes down there, she takes custody of the little boy, and the daughter gets out of the hospital, and the mother doesn't see the daughter anymore. And that's the photo of on the edge of the bathtub is this 2-year-old little boy. And I'm thinking to myself when I hear this story, that, you know, I had this young lady right in front of me. I was talking to her, but I couldn't get her to talk to me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help her, right? And then the more and more I started thinking about this, the more and more I started thinking, you know, really, I let her down. The person that molested her killed a little piece of her. And that trafficker who was trafficking her killed a little piece of her. And all those Johns that she was forced to have sex with every day, 10, 12, 15 men a day, they killed a little piece of her until eventually she takes her own life. But I let her down because I didn't know what to do. You know, and on the law enforcement patch, a lot of us have different things. On my agency's patch at the time, it said service and protection, and I didn't do either one of those. I did not protect her, and I did not give her any kind of service. And I thought to myself, I will never let this happen again. I'm not going to let these girls down. I got to figure out how to do this stuff. I got to figure out this trafficking stuff, because all across the country, we are letting these girls down. Law enforcement is letting them down. The community is letting them down. Together, we're all letting them down because we just don't know what to do. And that's part of the reason that we're here today, is that we're here to try to educate people on what the state of human trafficking is and what we can do together, because this is not just a law enforcement problem. This is a community problem. And law enforcement can't do this by ourselves. It really has to be the whole community working together. And that's some of the things that we're going to talk to you about today. So with that being said, I want to have my partner, Allison Phillips, come up here, and she's going to take you through the next 45 minutes or so, and hopefully we'll give a really good idea of what we can all do together.
Okay. First, I will start with this disclaimer, and I'll probably spend a little more time on this because we're in a church, and we're going to be talking about things that you don't normally talk about in a church, and we'll have some graphic images and maybe a little graphic language here and there. But if anyone has any trouble with any of this, I just invite you to take a breath, take a walk, any of that type of thing, because we're going to be very real with you, and we're doing that for a purpose because we want to practically equip you to see and understand this. And another tip too, one thing that I have found is helpful for me when we talk about these types of traumatic things is the way I deal with this in my mind is I see this as when you look into human suffering, I see that as entering into kind of a sacred space where we observe it with humility and kind of a solemn posture, and that helps me process this type of stuff. So like Dan said, our goals for you today are to help you identify human trafficking, but also identify common risk factors, and there's a purpose for that. We want you to learn what a comprehensive approach to this crime involves, and the reason for that is because we want everyone, I believe firmly that everyone has a role to play in this. This is not something that law enforcement alone is going to be able to solve. All of us need to be involved on some level. None of us can do it all. We all have to be working together. And by understanding what all is involved, this comprehensive approach, we can begin to become effective by that. I'm going to teach you some skills for interacting with victims. And mostly, I just want you to leave today feeling like I learned something, and I feel inspired, and I know what I have to offer. So human trafficking, I think if you're here today, if you're joined us online, you have some awareness of it. It is a huge problem in our world, in our country, and even here in Kansas City. Globally speaking, experts estimate that there are about 40 million individuals who are caught up in some form of human trafficking, whether it's labor or sex trafficking. They estimate it's a $150 billion industry. Now, so in terms of dollars, that makes it the second largest, most prevalent crime on earth, behind the illegal trade in drugs. And if you think about, I think all of us can see and recognize we know somebody whose life has been impacted by drugs. And yet to think about this crime being second behind it, and somehow most people are still doubting that this is happening in our midst, and it is. So I think that's a very helpful thing. So this is also, the other reason why we want to learn about this is it's not just about the victims. We are all, who directly pay a horrible price for this. We are all, as a society, paying a price for this. Putting the humanitarian aspects of this aside, human trafficking is costing us as taxpayers, as a nation, a lot. It's costing us in terms of criminal justice system expenditures to investigate, follow up, prosecute, put these folks in prison. It's costing us in terms of our strains on our healthcare system through victims. Social services, a lot of our victims have children, and the cycle goes on and on with them, and also through lost opportunity costs. So this graphic that I have up here, in 2016, the state of Texas did a study trying to put a dollar amount, an estimate to what human trafficking was costing their state annually. They estimated at the time that the lifetime expenditures for a human trafficking victim is $6.6 billion. That's something that we're all paying through these different things. This was in 2016. So I ask you, how much more now that we have opened our borders? A lot of those folks who are coming across our southern border of our country, this is being facilitated by cartels who intend to traffic a lot of those folks through sex trafficking, through labor trafficking. So this is something that we are all paying for. It will come up to Missouri and Kansas. We are all paying for this in some way or another. Okay, so what is human trafficking? Sadly, and this is why we're here today, sadly, I think a lot of people formulate their understanding of what human trafficking is through social media, through movies they've seen, maybe TV documentaries, those types of things. Those are not really good sources for helping understand what human trafficking is. I can't tell you how many people I've had in the last couple of years come up to me. They know I do this human trafficking work, and they're excited to talk to me and tell me about the latest thing that they learned on social media, some really inaccurate type of stuff. When the Wayfair, I don't know how many of you saw that whole Wayfair thing. Okay, when that thing started to happen, oh my goodness, my phone blew up. People are like, have you seen what Wayfair is doing? Okay, that was just fake news, okay? What we're hoping you're going to get from us today here is some good sense of what it is and what it really looks like and where to go for good information. So first of all, if we want to understand what human trafficking is, I want to start by, human trafficking is how it's defined by law. And this AMP model that I have up here, act means purpose, is really the simplest way of breaking down how the law defines what human trafficking is. Human trafficking it's an action. It can be recruiting someone for trafficking, transporting, harboring, and a thing called receipt of persons that I'll explain in a moment. So recruiting someone for human trafficking could be a 28-year-old young lady who's in the mall looking for desperate and lonely and insecure young girls to talk to them, offer them a modeling job, that kind of thing. That could be recruiting. A Uber driver who gets extra money paid by a pimp to take girls to dates is transporting somebody from one place to another. He's playing a part in this as well. You don't have to be doing all of these things to be engaging in human trafficking. A lot of larger human trafficking type of networks have individual people doing separate roles. By means of force, fraud, or coercion. And if you think about what does force, fraud, or coercion look like? It looks like somebody tricking someone, bait and switch type of scams. It looks like, it's not always like a violent threat or a violent act. It's a lot of it is just scam type of stuff. Coercion can look like a lot of things. It's just tricking someone into doing something without fully disclosing to them what they're getting into. I want you to think about that. The important thing to know about the means piece of this is when we're talking about minors under the age of 18, we don't have to have evidence of force, fraud, or coercion because they're minors. So you could conceivably have a 17-year-old that say they agree to engaging in commercial sex, prostitution, but that doesn't matter because the law defines it as if they're under 18, any kind of commercial sex act performed is by definition sex trafficking. So there is no such thing as a child prostitute. It's simply not possible, it's not logical, it's not how the law defines it for a purpose. And this is really simple. It usually just comes down to money, and that money is acquired by forcing someone into labor and taking all or most of the money earned, or through commercial sex acts, which can include prostitution, engaging in pornography, stripping, other erotic types of entertainment. We also see organ harvesting. There are some instances of that in the United States, but that's usually more something that we see in other countries. So these three things together equal human trafficking. So the common forms of human trafficking, we lump them into basically three different boxes. Labor trafficking in the United States, that usually comes down to unskilled labor pools, so like domestic servitude, agricultural areas, mining, fishery, factory work. A lot where you'll see a lot of labor trafficking would be in factories, for example, where a lot of the workers are immigrants who have come across the border. Their money is being controlled by someone else and handled that way. They live in overcrowded housing. That's where you'll see that type of thing. Most of these folks don't have any idea what their rights are. Sexual exploitation, again, takes many different forms. It's not just the brothel type of situation. It can be a lot of what we see on Independence Avenue or Prospect here in Kansas City. A lot of those girls actually have a pimp. There's somebody behind the scenes who's controlling them, who teaches them to say, I'm doing this myself for extra money or to pay for my drug habit, but really there is a pimp behind the scenes somewhere. It's even happening in a lot of our strip clubs. Sometimes girls who are being trafficked, their trafficker will take them to the strip club to perform. Strip clubs always want to have new girls to perform for the night. They do not keep the money. The pimp keeps the money. The club owner gets his cut and so forth, and then they leave, and she's been marketed for later that night. A lot of pornography is made under conditions of force, fraud, or coercion, or if it involves minors, somebody is profiting from that. One way to think about it is it's sexual exploitation with a camera on. And then we have this sort of other box that we lump other forms of human trafficking in. Some of these do happen in the United States, but these are more often like child soldiers, for example. That's something that is seen in Africa. Children sold for adoption, organ harvesting, begging, committing other types of crimes. Those kind of fall into that other form of human trafficking. In the United States, we mostly see sexual exploitation, human trafficking, but we certainly do have labor trafficking. And I would say one of the concerns I have for what's happening with our border is that we are going to see a huge increase in labor trafficking. That's a big purpose that all of that is happening for. So who is doing this? It's being done by organized crime, large organized crime, international organized crime, Asian organized crime, Russian organized crime. It's happening through kind of mid-size, local and even national street gangs, Mexican cartels, and but also domestically through friends and family. Those are big connectors of trafficking. Most of the domestic victims, most victims of human trafficking in the United States are domestic citizens. But of course, the United States, however, is a destination country for human trafficking. A lot of international victims are brought here for that purpose because we are an affluent country. Over the Western European countries are similarly destination countries also because they are affluent. And so people from poor, more desperate type of situations in countries are brought to these places for money. So further equipping you to see and understand what human trafficking is. So some common ways that human trafficking occurs, but it's not identified. And these are, I have 4 put up here. I would say these are the top ways that we just miss them. Labor trafficking is probably the #1 way because it looks like people working. And it's really hard. You have to know what to look for, the right questions to ask to ascertain that. And probably the best question, I think, for determining whether labor trafficking is happening somewhere is asking people how they get paid. Where does their money go? Because they don't have bank accounts, and the money from their paycheck isn't going into that bank account. That's probably your biggest clue. If somebody else is facilitating and handling that and taking portions of it, that's a big clue for labor trafficking. A lot of these victims who are working in a factory somewhere in Missouri, they came here with a promise that they could make a good living, and then these people making these promises offer, we'll get you housing, we'll set you all up, and so forth, but we'll get you across the border, we'll take care of all of this stuff. But along the way, they have a debt, and there are things that are asked of them. And so this is your fee for getting us across the border. This is your fee for your housing. This is your fee for your food. This is the fee for this and that. And now all of a sudden those fees become sometimes more than they're actually paid. Or it comes down to like they're just paid at pennies for an hour, which is the same as slave labor, right? So it's that bait and switch type of scam. Payment in exchange for the sexual abuse of a child. So I put this up here because a lot of kids who are being sexually abused, a lot of kids who are being sex trafficked, it's being misidentified as sex abuse cases only, because the people who are receiving the disclosure or who see indicators of sexual abuse in a child are missing that exchange of something of value for the sexual abuse of a child. They're missing that piece. So yes, in both cases, children who are being sex trafficked are being sexually abused, of course, right? But they are being sexually abused for an exchange. And it doesn't have to be money. It could be a place for mom to stay. It could be some kind of favor. It could be drugs, for example. We'll see a lot of that in kind of our rural Missouri communities where this is happening. Picking up on that, and what's really been a game changer is teaching healthcare workers or people who work with youth in schools to see that and pick up on those indicators. Paying a child under the age of 18 for sex. So on that slide I had earlier where I had that receipt of persons, that's what that refers to. In the case of minors where we don't have to have evidence of force, fraud, or coercion, that means you don't have to have a third-party controller. There doesn't have to be a pimp involved with the sexual exploitation of a child for it to be child sex trafficking. Anyone who pays money to have sex with a minor is engaging, what that receipt of persons piece means. So they, in effect, become the trafficker. And I think people miss that in this type of thing. So a third-party controller, a pimp, is not required since proof of force, fraud, or coercion is not relevant concerning minors engaging in commercial sex, called receipt of persons. So I want to emphasize that. Exchanging drugs or a place to stay or other considerations for sex is another thing that's missed. It doesn't always have to be money. And then a big one is pornography. Anytime pornography is made under conditions of force, fraud, or coercion, which most of mainstream pornography is. The actors who come and sign up to shoot pornography scenes very rarely are given full disclosures of what the scenes that they're about to shoot actually are going to involve. That is called fraud or coercion. Anytime it involves minors, somebody's profiting off the sexual exploitation of a child. It doesn't matter whether a camera is on or not. That's what that is. And I think there's a misconception that if it's mainstream pornography, somebody has vetted that, and that simply is not true. Pornhub is the world's largest mainstream purveyor of pornography. And they claim to have a screening process that validates whether or not people who are shown in the pornography are 18, but they don't actually do it in reality. There is millions and millions of content videos featuring minors, featuring people who did not know there was a camera on. and did not consent to it, and these corporations are making big money from it. Okay, so further, where is this happening? Sex trafficking is, it's often the prostitute, I put in quotes, that we think that's what she is or what she's doing on the street. But the reality is that there's more going on than that. Most of the women that we see on Independence Avenue who I think the average passerby would say that she is a prostitute, their story began with sexual abuse as a child in the home, and when they told mom what her boyfriend or stepdad or their uncle was doing, mom didn't want to believe it. She told her to stay silent about it, and the abuse continues, so she runs away. And then one negative thing after another happens in her life, and that's where she becomes. The other common scenario is they just got kicked out. So it's the same kind of thing. And I think when people actually listen and they understand and they see the stories behind the people who are on these streets, it shifts your whole entire paradigm of how you see this. I have never met a single person who thought she was a prostitute, who wasn't first sexually abused as a child, who didn't come from some kind of horrible dysfunctional home that really was not safe for them to be in, and they needed to find some way to escape that. And frankly, our society didn't have much to offer them, but these traffickers do. And that's where this goes. Most of these women on Independence Avenue and Prospect and so forth do have a pimp. They're under severe and intense pressure by threat of their lives to never ever say that they have a pimp. They have been coached over and over and over to say, I just do, I'm independent, I'm doing this on my own, this is how I pay my bills. And they will say that over and over and over again, but that doesn't mean it's true. It's not just that low-end type of stuff, it's also the well-kept escort that you will find online. That also, a lot of times, is somebody who is under the control of a trafficker and also making it look like she's doing it to herself. It's in illicit massage businesses. Ooh, this is a big one here in the United States. So Polaris, which is the nation's largest national anti-trafficking organization, they provide services of all kinds. They run the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and they track all kinds of data on human trafficking in our country. They estimate that in the United States, we have about 10,000 illicit massage businesses across the country. Through my work at the Attorney General's office and in the community, we've also been able to look into the prevalence of massage businesses in Missouri and Kansas. We estimate there are about 100 of those businesses in Missouri. About a third of them are in Kansas City, a third are in St. Louis, and the other third are kind of scattered around the state. In Kansas, I think it's about 70 or 65. About a third of those are in Olathe. So the story with the illicit massage businesses, this is how these women get to one of these businesses. Then the story usually starts in China or another Asian country with a young girl who is maybe being abused. Her, girls are undervalued, and a recruiter will come and approach the family and offer the American dream. Your daughter can come to the United States. We can get her a good job. She could send money back to you, to the family. We can help her get an education. It's about $6,000 to $10,000 is what you will owe us to get her there and set her up like that. But don't worry, she'll be making that money in no time. So for these families who are desperate, suffering in poverty, don't really care about their daughters that much anyway, that's a great deal. So they get signed up, they come here to the United States, they enter through California or New York, and then they're told to, they're basically asylum seekers. And because we don't follow up on what happens with people who seek asylum, and we let them in, we give them a court date for however many months later, we don't follow up on them, they disappear. and they are lost into this whole system in our United States, across the states, excuse me, where they are told that they can work in this massage business, but in order to pay off your debt, because see, here's how this works, the bait and switch works. So your debt is, let's say it's $10,000. Now, if I'm providing legitimate massage all day long, I'm never going to make enough money to start to pay off that debt, because that's how they have the system rigged. And now, but if I earn a tip, and the way you earn a tip is by providing a sex act. So to earn the tip, that's how I'm actually going to pay that debt off. And I'm under severe and intense pressure to pay that debt off because my family back in China has been threatened by them. They're going to kill my little brother or my mom if I don't earn the money to pay off the debt. And what do I have to do to earn that money? I have to be providing sex acts all day long to usually businessmen on their lunch hours, who think that this is something that these women want to do, that they're maybe providing help to them because otherwise they would be poor or something. So it's why we need to understand how victims are controlled. It's in the manufacture of pornography. I've talked about that. It's in strip clubs. I talked about one way that strip clubs are used in trafficking, where traffickers will bring girls to market them for later. But it's also a good place where traffickers will go and recruit girls, offer them more money that they can make. Strip clubs are very much integral into this. And one other thing I would say about strip clubs is one of the survivors I worked with who was trafficked here in the local area, I asked her one time, because I know she was, strip clubs were a big part of how she was marketed and sold. And so I asked her, I said, so your pimp would take you to these clubs and have you dance, and she said, yeah. And I said, so did you get to keep any of the money? And she looked at me and she laughed and she was like, no, that's not how it works. She said, we got drinks, but no, the money, we didn't keep any of the money. And I said, okay, so your pimp had a deal with these club owners where he could bring you in and do that. There was kind of an understanding. And she said, yes. And I said, were there particular clubs where this was set up, type of thing? And she laughed at me again, like, you're so naive. And she said, no, it's any of them. It's all of them. They just walk us in, and it's known and understood. It's online for sure. Labor trafficking is the biggest risk factor for that is being undocumented, not knowing what your rights are, and you'll usually see these in all kinds of unskilled labor pools. Okay. So businesses, common businesses that act as fronts, illicit massage businesses is certainly the number one thing. The way you can know if a business is an illicit massage businesses versus a legitimate one is actually very simple. So if you want to go get a massage and you don't want to make sure that you don't end up in one of these places, really all you have to do is look at the way that the businesses are advertising themselves. Legitimate massage businesses, the prevalence of the illicit businesses is really problematic for them. They don't want to have their workers solicited all day long for sex acts, right? So they work very hard to separate themselves and make it clear that we are a professional business. The nurses, the workers are dressed in nurse scrubs. The website has all the legitimate massage techniques listed on there. Versus the illicit ones, they are also wanting to advertise to a very specific clientele, right? Because they want people to come in asking for sex acts so they can get the tips. So their advertising is, it's more about the appearance of the masseuse. Like you'll see lots of pictures of women with their busts hanging out and things like that. That's not something that a legitimate massage place would do. The other way that you can tell is simply by putting the phone number of the business into a Google search and see what kind of search results you get. It's strip clubs, it's happening in bars, nail salons, labor trafficking. I like to get my nails done when I'm doing events like this, but I don't want to go to a nail salon where I'm getting services from somebody who's being exploited. So the way I do that is, again, I put the phone number of the nail salon into a Google search, and if 10 results for escort ads pop up on that phone number, that's a clue that that's not a nail salon you want to be going to, because those girls are doing more than just nails. Modeling studios are a big kind of bait and switch type of thing for young girls, because every young girl wants to be a model. Other examples that we've seen, barbershops, where you can pay extra money for the girl in the back. Same thing with gas stations. I've even heard of cases with an auto body shop here in town, housekeeping services. There's all kinds of examples of businesses that are fronts. We're going to take a little break here in a little bit, but before we do that, I want to talk about this little diagram that I have up here, because this is the core of what we're going to do with the rest of our time here. I call this our roadmap to success. This is how we fight human trafficking, by having all of these things here in place. So it starts with identifying somebody who is at risk, and we'll talk about what an at-risk person is. Somebody with vulnerabilities, because that's what human trafficking is. If you really want to understand what human trafficking is at its core, it's exploitation of vulnerability. So what do vulnerabilities look like? And what do we do with somebody who has vulnerabilities? Well, ideally, we would prevent their exploitation. So that's probably the biggest piece. And that is not really something that is law enforcement's job. And this is what I'm hoping you're going to see as I talk about this. This is a big job. This is not something that law enforcement can do alone. They need all of us to be active and engaged in this. So we start with a person who is at risk for this, and we can do one of two things. We can help prevent their exploitation, and if we fail at that, then we go down this other road. So we have not prevented their exploitation. Now they become a victim. In order to rescue this person, to get them out of this, to intervene in what's happening to them, we first have to be able to identify them. And so we're going to teach you identification skills so you can recognize these people when you see it, know what to do with that, how to report it, and to who, so that we can have this rescue or intervention. And that is the piece that I see primarily as law enforcement's job, if we're going to do it well and do it effectively. Yes, people are rescued or taken out of this life without law enforcement's help all the time, but if we don't have their involvement, the bad guy just continues to do what he's doing, and he's just going to go find another victim. So we really ideally want to have this to be a law enforcement-centered type of thing. But in order for law enforcement to do that, first of all, we have to identify the victim, and yes, law enforcement can do that, but they need us as a community also to identify it. Probably some of our biggest, we call them funnel points, places where we can identify victims would be in our hospitals, our healthcare systems. Most victims at some point during their exploitation pass through the door of a hospital, and yet very few of them are identified there because we haven't had that training to teach people how to identify it. If we can have our healthcare workers trained on this, wow, it'd be amazing. Another big funnel point where we can catch a lot of victims is in our schools. And don't think that your nice suburban or private school is exempt from this. All of our schools need to be trained on this. Anybody working with kids, key places, transportation. There's a lot of efforts to train semi-truck drivers, over-the-road truck drivers or in truck stops, because those are funnel points too. Teaching people how to identify this is big, so we can get to that rescue first, because we're never going to have that rescue or intervention if we first haven't identified them. So then once we've done that, then that's where the real work begins. We need to have services in place for our victims, and those are really very resource-intensive types of things. And because if we rescue a victim, it does us no good to do that if we don't have a place for them to go, if we don't address the vulnerabilities that first got them in that place. When I was working for the state of Missouri, we ran human trafficking operations. And every time we had a victim that we would bring back to the command center, we had victim advocate teams there ready to provide services for these victims. And that was a really, really important aspect of these operations. And I would tell the law enforcement officers participating in the operation that I would say, if we don't have these victim advocates here to help provide services for our victims, we might as well not even be doing this at all, because they're going to walk right out the door and they're going to go right back into the situation that they were in before, and the cycle will never stop. And you think we're doing something by having these operations, but if we aren't addressing the needs of these victims, it'll never stop. Similarly, we need to have the bad guys, we need to have prosecution, we need to have good prosecutors who are also educated on this, who are going to do their job on this too. So obviously what I have described to you here is a very big thing. This is not something that any of us, any agency can do by themselves. And I think because we're sitting in a church, I think a really great way to think about this, and I think it's God's intention in this, is if you think about how we have been taught, Jesus taught us to be the hands and feet of Christ. Each of us has a piece in it. And so what I'm hoping you'll leave with today is some inspiration of, this is what I have to offer. This is where I can fit into this roadmap. This is something that I can offer. You don't have to do it all. I think that's where people get really overwhelmed by this problem, because it's massive. I mean, I just described that to you at the beginning. 40 million people around the world. I mean, good heavens, that makes me want to go home and just take the day off, because I can't solve that. Nobody can, right? But I do recognize what I have to offer in this, right? And I believe each of us who are, whether you're here in this church with us today, whether you're watching online, has something in that. And as I go through more of this, I'm hoping that you will find that and see that. Okay, I'm going to just go through this one more part here before we go on our break. I want to talk about what an at-risk person is, what this looks like. The most common vulnerabilities in human trafficking victims are a history of abuse, and I said this before, and this is true for Dan. All of the survivors that I have worked with over the last 10 years of doing this, I have not met a single one who wasn't first sexually abused as a child. They came from some kind of dysfunctional family life where they didn't have a protective mother and father, caring adult looking out for them. That is probably the biggest on-ramp for this. Kids who are missing, we'll talk more about that. Homelessness is a big one. Poverty, of course. I described to you how a young woman ends up in an illicit massage business. What was the vulnerability there? Poverty. The family didn't have enough resources to provide for their family. Those are common risk factors. Being undocumented is certainly a big one, and also at-risk online behavior is a big one. So thinking about what does an at-risk person look like. COVID certainly introduced a whole load of additional vulnerabilities in the lives, especially of young people who are stuck at home, struggling with all kinds of mental health problems, loneliness, isolation, depression. Our suicide rates are really alarming because of lockdowns and just all that we've lost because of COVID. Kids are spending more and more time online and in unprecedented ways. And while the kids are at home spending more and more time online, guess who else is at home spending more and more time online? Talking to our kids. Sex offenders, right? In 2020, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children said that the reports of online sexual solicitation doubled from 2019. So that's a very big and real thing. At the same time, these kids were no longer in front of mandated reporters. They're not at church, they're not at school, where they have an opportunity to be identified or reported, some kind of intervention put in place for these kids. So it's really a very troubling kind of perfect storm for people looking to take advantage of these kids. So if I think the most important work that we can do in human trafficking is going to look nothing like human trafficking. It's going to be because we're going to prevent it from happening in the first place. And I think our churches are ideal places to do this. And many churches already have ministries that address these type of vulnerabilities. they have outreach for homeless folks. They have food pantries. Those are vulnerabilities that oftentimes are on-ramps for this. I'm going to start by talking about sexual abuse because that's a big one. If we want to prevent this from happening, we need to address the problem of sexual abuse of our children. Most sexual abuse and assault is not committed by strangers. If we're educating our kids that way, we are really, really leaving them open to this, because most of it's acquaintances and family members. About half of all offenders who commit sexual abuse on a child are acquaintances, so that's the red half of the circle there, in case you can't read it. And about a quarter to a third, which is represented by the orange slice of that pie, are family members. So the best way that you can prevent the sexual abuse of a child is by looking at recognizing grooming. If these are people that our kids already know, how do we control that? How do we look out for the uncle at the family gathering, or the person at our child's church youth group, or the sports team coach, or something like that? How do I see that coming? And there's obviously, it's by understanding what grooming is and what it looks like, and recognizing those patterns, because these people use the same patterns over and over. So what is grooming? It's a combination of psychological manipulation, brainwashing, seduction, intimidation, and sometimes it happens over an extended period of time. Exploiters will not only groom potential victims, but they will groom everyone around them. Not just the victim. They want everyone, the family, anyone who could potentially intervene in the child's abuse, to think that this is the greatest guy ever, because they've been groomed too. And the purpose is to gain a sense of trust and dependency and normalize abuse. So where is this happening? It's happening through social media, big time. Gaming systems, even anything with a chat function where an adult can talk to a kid, any kind of apps with chat functions. It's really happening anywhere where kids are. The reason why abusers and traffickers, they use this grooming technique rather than just abducting a child and abusing them, or whether it's trafficking them or sexually abusing them, is the victims are more likely to comply, they're less likely to run away, they're more likely to blame themselves for what's happening to them because of this grooming process. And because everyone else around the child has been groomed as well, they're not even going to see it coming. They're going to think he's a good guy. So the patterns of grooming are really the same. Perpetrators, they look for a suitable target, somebody with vulnerabilities that they can exploit. A kid whose parent is not involved in their life is a big one. A kid who's online, broadcasting their whole life for the world, and nobody is paying attention to what they're doing online, are huge, huge ways. They work over time to gain trust and become the person. They find that whatever that vulnerability is and become the answer to that problem. And it doesn't have to be a bad thing. It could be something that a kid wants. So they break down barriers, push healthy boundaries, normalize things that otherwise wouldn't have been normalized, and they do it over time. And they isolate and marginalize the kid to basically create a dependency. So I worked with a parent several years ago. Her child was groomed online. She was staying with grandma and grandpa for a couple weeks while the parents were on vacation. So grandma and grandpa didn't have a clue about what kids do online. I mean, they just had no idea. Mom and dad were normally pretty involved in that type of thing, but they were on vacation. And so during this 2 weeks, this young girl who was a great student, involved in all kinds of things, came from a really good family, found somebody on a chat room and started talking to him. And she basically, what this guy who groomed her over several weeks, I think it was even up to a year, what he identified in her as her vulnerability is that this girl wanted to be like a world changer. She wanted to get out in the world, like the Peace Corps or something like that, and really, really change things. And so this guy kind of grabbed onto that and started talking to her about it, and he became the answer to how that her dream could be lived out. And he talked through weeks and weeks, got to know her very well, know everything about her, and he basically worked out a plan where she could achieve that dream through him. And he convinced her to leave home, to go to school one day, and leave town and get on a train. Unfortunately, there was the parents got involved, and there was an intervention before she got to her destination, where she was probably going to become a prostitute. But this young girl she thought she was doing something really good. But she's just a naive kid, like any of us were at one point in our lives, right? And they're easily psychologically manipulated, brainwashed like that. And this girl didn't do anything, that we would think of as like bad or get in trouble. She had just been groomed for a long time. And so recognizing patterns of grooming are important in many ways. So as a parent, as a grandparent, as a caring adult with any kid who is at risk, because it usually starts with childhood, be involved in your child's life, talk to them regularly. You can't have like these one-time talks about internet safety and then think you're good. You have to be talking to them online about what they're doing online all the time. If they can't talk to you about the little things in their life, they're not going to talk to you about the big things. Being a safe person, know who their friends are, know who they're talking to online, monitor their chats, put monitoring apps on their phones, and be aware of perhaps what these vulnerabilities and insecurities are, and teach them to recognize grooming patterns in their own life. I'll just tell you that I myself, I have 3 teenagers. My kids don't have smartphones. I give them a thing called, it's a GAB phone, G-A-B-B. It's a dumb phone. They can call, text, take pictures. They can't send or receive pictures because my teenage boys are not getting nudes from girls in their high school. Yay, right? And what I will say is my kids are the only ones in their entire school that don't have smartphones. So that's quite a thing to ask of a kid these days. But, they don't hate me for it, because I've been talking to them in very real and frank ways for years about why. Because I see what happens to these kids online through social media. I know how toxic it is. And it's not necessarily that every kid who has social media on their phone, it's not just about sex trafficking. It's about bullying. It's about a toxic environment that doesn't teach them about healthy relationships or how to respect their peers or how to have a relationship with someone of the opposite sex. None of that is happening through social media on these phones, and they don't need it. They don't. They can call me, they can text their friends through these phones. It's fine, but you got to talk to them about it if you're going to do that. So the phones are big. We're going to talk more about the phones today. 83% of active sex trafficking cases in 2020 involve some element of online solicitation. So if you want to address the vulnerabilities, this is a big one. Huge piece of this. It's overwhelmingly the most common tactic that traffickers use to solicit sex buyers and get kids recruited and involved in this. 65% of underage victims recruited online in 2020. Active criminal sex trafficking cases were recruited through Facebook. 14% were recruited through Instagram. 8% were recruited through Snapchat. So just even mainstream apps. So paying attention to what kids are doing on their phones. Social media is today's stranger danger. Kids are spending a ton of time on social media, and 95% of teens have a smartphone. I think it's probably higher than that based on what my kids tell me. So we gotta watch it. Before I go into this part, I think we're at a good place to take a break. So it's 10:10 right now. Why don't we come back at 10:20? We can have a bathroom. There's food and coffee in the back. And for those of you who are online, we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. They can text their friends through these phones, it's fine. But you got to talk to the phones are big. We're going to talk more about the phones today. 83% the phones are big. We're going to talk more about the sex trafficking cases in 83% of active some element of online sex trafficking cases in 2020. So if you want to address the vulnerabilities, solicitation. So if you want to address the vulnerabilities, this is a big one. Huge.
So far from home. Ooh, I am a captive to your ways. And when you whisper, I am changed, I feel you flowing through my veins. I'm almost human. my heart had no other home. Let these hands have no other crown. Let these knees fall on no other ground. Draw these eyes from the gold that won't shine. You turn this life from water to wine. Oh, I tremble. I tremble in your presence. In your presence. You take my breath with every star and night. Show your power in downtown city lights. You are higher than the tallest of the hills and stronger than the walls we tried to build. You blind me with the beauty of your face and draw me close with your divine embrace. You speak to me with healing in your words and fix the things I didn't know were hurt. Lord, I tremble. I tremble, Lord, in your presence. In your presence. Oh, I tremble. I tremble, Lord, in your presence. In your presence. My Lord, my Lord, my Lord, my Lord, my Lord. To you alone be praised. You could take the
Okay, why don't we get back started? So I want to talk a little bit about pornography. Got your attention now? And actually, you know, it might seem, I can't tell you how many churches I've stood in up front and talked about pornography. It's the weirdest thing. But I honestly, I think there's no better place to talk about pornography than a church. Because if we don't talk about it here, where are we going to talk about it? We need to talk about it honestly and frankly because we are a porn-obsessed society. You need to know how this plays a role in sex trafficking. First of all, what it does is it normalizes the commodification, the objectification of our human sexuality. It's used by traffickers to groom their victims and create expectations. It's how they teach them what to do, what will be expected of them. It's basically the training manual. It's a form of sextortion. A lot of victims who have been featured in pornography or pornography has been made of them, sexual content like that, it can be used to blackmail them into doing more. Every survivor that I have talked to, and there's a lot of research too, where survivors are interviewed and they're asked about, you know, what was it that buyers wanted from them? A lot of it is these buyers are addicted to pornography, and they have fantasies that they want to act out, but these are not things that they're going to be able to ask their wife or girlfriend. So they buy somebody that they can do this with. It would not be a good idea to ask your girlfriend, hey, let's pretend I'm going to rape you tonight. It's not a relationship builder. But that's a lot of times what these survivors say that was asked of them. Let's play out this scenario. It's really troubling. But so it not only acts as like the marketing department and the training department for trafficking, it also is trafficking whenever it involves minors or is made of adults under conditions of force, fraud, or coercions. And the viewer cannot tell whether or not what you're seeing is mainstream stuff. So I told you I have 3 teenagers, and so I've been talking to them in little snippets here and there over the years about the dangers of pornography because even though they don't have smartphones. I know that they're going to see it. They've seen it. There's simply no way that you can be a walking human being in our society today and not be exposed to pornography in some way or form. But I want them to know the truth about what they're seeing. And this is something that I encourage you as parents to be really proactive about with your kids. And you probably need to be having these conversations with your kids earlier than you ever want to, seriously, because they should hear it from you first. I think the first time I talked to my boys was when they were like 8 or 9, because that's what the research tells us, they're gonna see it. So when they do see it, I want them to go, oh, that's what mom told me about. Those are those pictures, and this is why my brain freaked out, and what happened in my brain and why, and this is what I'm supposed to do with it. So did I want to have that conversation with my 8-year-old? No, I don't, but I recognize that's the society we live in. Pornography is a horrible teacher of human sexuality. It does not teach good lessons about consent because it's just not there. A lot of analysis has been done on mainstream pornography content, shows that a lot of it features violence, women being choked, rough and abusive type of sex, rape videos. And it really, at the bottom of it is it teaches that sex is a commodity. It's not something where there's a relationship, there's no personality. And I think that's a horrible, horrible thing for our kids to be training their brains to be aroused by, right? And becoming addicted to that type of form of it. So what it's teaching our girls is it's teaching them that in order to be desirable by men, but by their peers, that they have to look and act a certain way. And that's why you see girls doing a lot of the things that they're doing that don't make sense, because they realize that what young men want is what they're seeing in porn, so they conform to that and become like that. I think it's really sad. It's teaching our boys that they have to perform in order to be considered a real man, and that sex is really just like a game where you rack up points. It's not about relationship or respect or consent. So pornography is, so this statistic is real interesting, I think. 80% of child sexual abuse offenders also possess child sexual abuse material. Shows you the prevalence there. Fantasy, it creates a fantasy which leads to desire, and desire leads to action. Okay, so while we're talking about risk factors, we want to talk about kids who are missing or runaways. Why do kids run away? Well, the reality is that most of them are not running away because they're bad kids or they want to go have, go to parties and live this exciting life. I mean, some of that's true, that they want to go out and get in trouble. But a lot of them, most of them actually are, it's not that they're running to something, it's that they're running away from something. And they're running away from abuse in the home. They've been groomed or tricked and coerced into running away by someone who tends to exploit them. And what I think is important for us as law enforcement or as concerned citizens to understand is that increasingly the difference between a kid who's been abducted and run away is that line is really being very blurred. So we shouldn't have a different response to that. So many kids are being groomed online into being tricked into running away, like the young girl that I was talking about who had been groomed online for all that time to go meet this guy who was going to help her live out her life dream. Did she run away or was she abducted? It's kind of hard to say. It's a little of both, right? But what's the difference in terms of us who recognize that girl, once she is on that train or with that guy in his car, she's at risk. She's endangered, right? Either way, it doesn't really matter. Our response should be the same. I knew of a case several years ago where a young woman was being groomed online for several weeks, and the groomer, his goal was to meet her in person so he could take her and exploit her. And what he did was meeting place was at a Quick Trip, like a popular gas station. And the reason why he had their meeting place to be a very public place was he wanted her to be shown on camera walking on her own accord and getting in the car with him. And he did that on purpose so that an Amber Alert couldn't be sent out, so that she would be considered a runaway. But really, I mean, the way that she had been brainwashed and groomed all that time, I'd say the line is blurred. So the reason why I say all that to say is there really is not a lot of difference these days between a runaway and a groomed person, and there shouldn't be one in terms of a response. All of these kids they're missing and they're at risk and they're in terrible danger. So, but kids don't have to be missing necessarily to be at risk. There are plenty of kids who are living at home with their families, and they're being exploited through incest, sexual assault, through familial trafficking. I have worked with several survivors who their trafficker was their mother, who was allowing men to come into the home and pay money to sexually abuse her, as it was their way basically that's how she paid the family bills. There's certainly been cases where mothers do that to pay for their drug habit that way. Those are familial trafficking. Kids are exploited online, sometimes by people who they've never even seen in person because of camming, things like OnlyFans. It can happen that way too. It doesn't have to be a stranger. So thinking about that diagram that I put up earlier with the at-risk person and all the things that are needed to happen to it, if you want to get involved and help prevent this from happening in the first place, it's going to look nothing like trafficking. It's going to be getting involved in addressing vulnerabilities. One of the greatest things that we can do to prevent trafficking is to support single mothers. There's an advocate I worked with. She told a story about an interview that she did with a victim, and she asked the survivor, what was it? Was there like a specific moment in your life where that kind of tipped the scale for you? You know, where if something had happened, things could have gone differently for you. And she said, yes, I know exactly that moment. She said it was when our family car broke down and my mom didn't have the money to fix it. And she had to get a second job to get another car. And so me and my sister were left home alone for hours and hours. And the neighbor in the apartment complex knew that. And she said, so it was something as simple as fixing the car can make all the difference in the life of somebody. Things like that. Supporting families in crisis similarly. So many families who are in crisis, their problems can be fixed by paying a utility bill or helping them catch up with rent or things like that. So that domino effect doesn't start like I'm talking about with a young girl with the broken down car. Supporting efforts to assist the homeless. I'm always very, very concerned about homeless women in particular. Anybody who's LGBTQ on the streets, they are super vulnerable to this stuff, especially anything that we can do to help those people can make a big difference in this type of thing. There's a statistic research that was done several years ago that said, I think it was like 82% of sex trafficking victims who were female at some point or another had been homeless. So that's a big on-ramp. We can get involved and support anything that helps the homeless through shelters, food pantries, rent assistance, those types of things can make a difference. Supporting sensible immigration policy is obviously a very, very big one. I would say the entire illicit massage business problem that we have in our country, a lot of our labor trafficking problems can be tied back to lax immigration policy. So we need to be writing our representatives about that. It's humanitarian, not political. Supporting outreach efforts. There are lots of folks who go out into strip clubs, into streets, reaching out to vulnerable people, helping build relationships, and figuring out what their vulnerabilities are and helping them with that. Are fabulous opportunities to address vulnerabilities, and of course paying attention to what kids do online is big. And also an important part of preventing this is addressing demand. Human trafficking is not some natural disaster, weather phenomena. It's not a tornado. It's happening because there's money for it. And the money is in sex trafficking is coming from sex buyers. Their money fuels this industry. That's why traffickers go out and spend all this time recruiting victims, because there's money for it. We've got to educate people about the reality of what they are doing whenever they go out and pay money for a sex act. It is not a harmless thing like, some of these bachelor party, whatever those movies are, make it out to be like it's a joke. What the survivors I have worked with tell me is that a lot of these Johns are seeking to act out sexualized violence that they couldn't ask of a partner. They want to have sexual access to a child and don't want to spend all the time grooming them, so they can just pay a pimp to give them one. And they want to act out, and this is particularly, I think, helpful to understand, is that many with our LGBTQ kids or transsexual kids, those people are super vulnerable to this, because there's a whole segment of people who want to experiment with their sexuality or this different type of thing. So the best way they can do that without drawing attention to themselves, so it can be anonymous and relationship free, is to pay for it. And because that's kind of a very specific product, if you will, the demand for it is very high, and the cost, because they will pay more money for it. So these young people are in really, really high demand. They're at very high risk for this, because there's a market for people who want that. Does that make sense? Okay. They want to fulfill a desire inspired by pornography. And I think an interesting thing to know is for the law enforcement in the room watching this, that sex buying clusters with other criminal behaviors. In fact, in the UK and Canada, about 65% of homicides are committed by sex buyers. So they don't just do that. They actually commit a lot of other crimes, especially crimes of violence against women, domestic violence, sexual assault. So whenever you have the opportunity to put in a deterrent of an arrest with a buyer, please do it, because it can prevent other types of things as well. Okay, so now I want to get into, we talked about prevention, and now I want to go into identification. So back to our at-risk person with the vulnerabilities. First, we want to try to prevent their exploitation first. I think that's, we can all agree that would be the ideal world to be in, where every time we have somebody at risk or vulnerable, we wrap around them and support them so that they're never exploited in the first place. Fortunately, that's not the reality we live in. Many at-risk people are exploited. So now what do we do? Well, if we're going to help them rescue, intervene, get them out of that situation, we first need to be able to identify them. And I see this as everybody's job. Everybody can do this. But if you work in specific fields, you are like schools, healthcare, law enforcement, transportation. If you work in any of those places, you are especially positioned to identify victims, and that's where this training can become really, really impactful and make a difference. So generally speaking, what you can look for is control, because that's what human trafficking is. It's one person controlling another. So what does that look like? What does control look like? Somebody who's not in control of their life, and becoming kind of an expert in seeing that and recognizing it when you see it is big. So anytime anytime a minor is being sold in any form of commercial sex, this is human trafficking. Anytime you see evidence of him control, this is trafficking. Okay, so thinking about control, what is control? Somebody who is not in control of their life can't come and go as on their own. There are rules about where they can go, what they can do, things like that. They will be isolated from the community. They're not going to be allowed to, go out and hang out with friends, and build relationships and talk to other people. victims who are minors, they might not be attending school, and this is, where you'd want to think, okay, of course, last year, no kids were in school, but so what is normal, for kids? They're very rarely allowed to freely contact friends. They might be driven around by somebody else. So paying attention to things like that. Somebody who's being controlled won't necessarily won't be in control of their possessions. They might not have their ID, their wallet. Somebody else has their stuff. They don't have their own bank account. They're not depositing their own money. Somebody else is handling for that type of thing for them. That's a big question that you can ask people about how, their money, because obviously this is all about money for these people. How do you get paid? Where does that, how does the money handled? A lot of folks do not have their own ID because that's a powerful way to control them, and they don't necessarily speak for themselves. Sometimes I've heard of cases where these victims don't even know what town they're in. If you don't know what town you're in, that is not a person who is in control of their life, right? Somebody else is obviously calling all the shots for a person like that. Other things you can pay attention to are changes in dress or appearance. And it wouldn't necessarily have to be like where you go from kind of wearing t-shirt and jeans to kind of overtly sexual stuff. Sometimes it can be the other way, where now all of a sudden a young person is like hiding behind big sweatshirts and things like that. So just noticing big changes either way. Having possessions that you can't, it doesn't make sense how they could maybe get the money to have those things. Their job or their family or their socioeconomic status does not explain how would they get something like this. Working long hours, the presence of an older boyfriend is a big red flag for sure. You definitely want to be asking questions about that. For those of you who work in any kind of healthcare setting, somebody coming in repeatedly with STIs, STDs, any kind of chronic medical issues like that, any child who has that type of thing going on, definitely we should be asking questions. I know that seems obvious, but I'm saying it because it gets missed all the time. She's not just like some slutty girl. Something might be happening, and we should be asking questions. That shouldn't be the assumption at all. Who has access to their money? How are we doing in school? Paying attention to mental health cues. Lots of red flags in this. Loss of interest in hobbies. That would be a kind of a mental health thing. Working long, excessive hours. These women who work in these massage businesses, they're in there all the time. They work 7 days a week. Many of them actually live in the massage business itself. They have like little cots that they'll roll out. That's not a normal work environment, right? I think we could all recognize that. Anybody who's in a work environment where they're not taking normal breaks, where they don't have the usual workers' rights, they owe a debt is a big one in labor trafficking especially. How they were hired or recruited for the job, those are questions you can ask too. How did you get this job? Those types of things. And high security measures, can they leave the workplace? Like in the massage businesses, all those girls are monitored by camera all the time. Labor trafficking is, a lot of this is controlled by organized crime, international organized crime. So things to pay attention to are living conditions, how people are paid, and signs of control or physical abuse. There was a case a number of years ago here in the Kansas City area with a roofing company that was engaging in labor trafficking. And one of the big indicators that tipped that case off was the living conditions and how the workers were housed. There were many, many men in a very overcrowded, tiny apartment. That would not be a normal type of thing. And typically we see this in these low-paying, unskilled labor pools. So the prevalence of this, I think, is interesting for you to know. These studies were done a while ago, but it's the most recent ones that I could find. San Diego State University found that 31% of undocumented Spanish-speaking migrant workers had experienced labor trafficking. Interesting. 71% of labor trafficking victims in a study by the Urban Institute entered the United States on a lawful visa. So many of those were like asylum-seeking Chinese cases. Those are, going to assume, mostly in the massage businesses. The average price that a victim paid in recruitment fees to come here to the United States was about $6,000. And of course, as immigration policy changes, these dynamics change too. There are people making a lot of money on this. Other signs are claiming that they are just here visiting, maybe not know where they are, that type of thing. Unclear about what date or time it is. Not sure. That would be another clue that somebody doesn't know, is not in control of their life. Their stories might not be inconsistent because they have been coached to have a cover story, but that only goes so far. So the more questions you ask and you find inconsistencies in their story, you can keep asking things like that. In terms of what to look for physically, signs of abuse, but you won't always see this. So, a lot of trafficking victims, whether it's labor trafficking victims or sex trafficking victims, are physically abused as a way of maintaining control of them. But sometimes those bruises are underneath clothing, so you won't necessarily see them because you want to avoid detection. So paying attention to bruises, maybe in multiple stages of healing. When my kids were younger, and they were, rough and tumble and falling off their bikes and stuff like that, they would have bruises and cuts and things on them all the time, right? But those bruises and cuts are here on their elbows and their knees, and in places that when you trip and fall, that's where the contact hits. Bruises that are indicative of abuse are more common to like restraint. So those would be if you're being held down or on your arms, so you can look for like finger pad type of things, any kind of choking. Those are not normal bruises. So that's kind of how you can tell the difference. We'll show you some pictures of tattoos that are common to trafficking, both for victims and traffickers. But also pay attention to just the general appearance of someone. If they appear disheveled, maybe they haven't it looks like they haven't changed their clothes in a week, things like that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who looks rough. One of the survivors I worked with, she was sold by her trafficker on kind of high dollar escort type of sites. He made every effort to make sure that she looked perfect. She got her nails done. She was never had any kind of, she was very well groomed, all of that type of stuff, had the nicest clothing, things like that. So that's not an always type of thing. And what I asked her about it was, I said, so what could have someone seen by looking at you? Because if you looked all put together, what was the indicator? She didn't have tattoos. She said, you could have seen my body language. I wouldn't have looked you in the eye. I wouldn't have talked without being given permission to. You could tell just by looking at my body language and the way I answer questions. So it can be clean or dirty, good or bad hygiene. Food deprivation is a big one for a lot of these folks. Their pimps will use that as a way of controlling them. So being malnourished, underweight, or maybe they're being controlled by the trafficker introduced like a drug addiction to them as a way, I'm the source for your addiction and I can control you that way. Looking at the skin color appearing normal, one of the operations that we did when I was working for the state, one of the victims that we brought into the command center, she had been obviously through a lot, and I would say food deprivation was probably involved. She was addicted to drugs, probably had not slept in a long time. When we brought her into the command center, she looked green. I mean, her lips were blue. She was probably on death's door because of all the stuff that she had been through. And then paying attention to how does this person compare to others that are present around them. Paying attention to clothing is a big one. So one of the advocates that I've had the pleasure of working with over the years, she told me a story one time about it was Saturday morning and she was just trying to relax and take the morning off, and so she went to a local coffee shop here in town and pulled up a table and was just enjoying her coffee and relaxing on this nice morning. And she's sitting in this back table, and this young woman comes in, and she's kind of in a rush and, all kind of stressed. So my friend knows what to look for, right? So immediately she picks up on the body language of this young woman. She seems stressed. She's in a rush. Something's going on a Saturday morning in a coffee shop. And then she looks at, she's wearing a sweatshirt, pajama pants, but she has a suitcase with her. She's like, why a suitcase? Who brings a suitcase to a coffee shop on a Saturday morning? So 2 bells go off, right? Body language, suitcase. Okay, so now she's looking more. And then she said, then I looked down at her shoes. And then I knew something was wrong. So, all right, ladies, if it's Saturday morning and we're relaxing in our pajama pants, having a warm cup of coffee, what do we have on our feet? Yes. She had on a really nice pair of, pumps. She said, then I knew something was wrong. So anyway, this girl gets her coffee and happens to sit down at the table next to my friend. And so my friend chats her up and starts talking to her and found out, sure enough, she was a trafficking victim. She had just left her boyfriend's apartment while he was passed out or whatever, threw her stuff in a suitcase and popped into the coffee shop just to have a moment to herself to think about what in the hell she was going to do next. And I thank God that my friend happened to be sitting there next to her, and she got her help and assistance. But so anyway, just paying attention to what's normal. Is the clothing normal for the season? Are the shoes normal? Somebody who is in control of their life will be dressed appropriately for the season, have proper shoes on, things like that. So you can pay attention to things like that. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about terminology, and I'm going to invite my friend Megan to come up here and talk about this, because this is something that you can pay attention to as well. There's a whole language in trafficking, and if you hear some of these words, maybe sometimes people appropriate that stuff, but maybe not. And so Megan is... Come on up here, Megan. So Megan is a peer support specialist. She is a program participant with Restoration House. She's also a survivor, so she can speak to this quite well, and I'm really glad she is here today to add in on all this kind of stuff.
Okay. Daddy is what victims are supposed to call their trafficker pimp. Babe is usually what a victim will call either the John or the Trick himself. Girls that are in the stables will be calling each other wifeys, or sisters-in-laws would be either a pimp partner, trafficker's friend, that they are really close to each other and will work with other girls that are in his stable and go on dates together. Wifey-in-law is the same thing too. A stable is where traffickers have multiple girls living together in one household, and under full control by the pimp himself. And then,
So when, in your experience, did you use all these words?
yes,
Any
every single
others?
one.
Yeah.
Yes. The lifestyle is the game, the hustle, which is prostitution language. The bottom, which is the bottom girl. From my experience, from being trafficked for 10 years, I got trafficked at 17 years old, and I ended up coming with my second trafficker for 8 years, and I was a bottom myself, which is the highest ranking girl, usually brings in the most money, has been there the longest, has control of other girls. When it's time to go to work, you take them back and forth. In some stables, girls, the bottom collects the money. I wasn't in that situation where I collected money, but also too, Oh, also too, the bottom girl gets the most beatings. They take more of that in because they're the most manipulated ones. And usually, from where I had came from, was I didn't have family or anything, so we're more easily to keep manipulated because where will we go if there's no help? And the trap is your quarter at the end of the night where you give your pimp all your money. The track, the blade, the strip, the stronghold, the block, that is working areas where the girls work.
This is where I'm going to have Dan talk about tattoos. And
Okay.
he can do that with you because
Okay.
you certainly have it. You keep that.
Okay.
Okay. So tattoos are a big thing used in the trafficking world, and it's also a pretty easy way for many of us to identify someone that might be involved in trafficking. So tattoos can sometimes be hidden. They kind of have a general common theme. We'll get into the difference between like a trafficking, like a trafficker tattoo versus the victim tattoo versus a predator or someone who is going after like a child or something like that. Because all the tattoos are completely different, right? Some of them have references to prostitution. Some of them are meant to convey ownership and control. Some of them have references to money. And sometimes they're really professional, and then other times they're like homemade, where you can clearly tell that they're made in somebody's basement or something like that. So Megan has tattoos that were part of what she survived when she was in the lifestyle. So tell us a little bit about your tattoos.
The first tattoo that I have, I still have visible, which was my first trafficker that's tatted on my neck. And you see a lot of girls in visible places where they can see from other pimps will know of who that belongs to, because usually pimps all know of each other. Traffickers stay well connected with one another. So do the girls that work together. Also, too, initial with the crown is another one, too. Property, Mac, Daddy's girl, and then the name, and then bitch is another one. You can tell that's another branding from the trafficker.
So if you look at these tattoos, if you can see them, you can see the one with the bird is obviously much more professionally done, probably done by an actual tattoo artist at a tattoo shop. And then some of the others look a little more like, yeah, maybe they were done in a tattoo shop, but maybe they were done by somebody that's not a professional, somebody in a basement, somebody in a house, somebody wherever in the back room of a business. It can be really any of those things. But again, daddy's really, really important for law enforcement people. If you're searching through someone's phone and you see daddy, especially if it's D-A-D-D-I, that is a really big clue, because that's not their father, okay? That is going to be their trafficker. Or when you hear them talking about their daddy wanted me to do this, or their daddy sent me here, they're talking about their trafficker. Sometimes they will also use the term of like boyfriend or something like that, or sometimes they'll even say fiance. I've heard that a few times as well. But if you ask the right questions, you'll be able to figure out pretty quickly, is it really a... And just because they're a boyfriend or a fiance or a husband, that doesn't mean that they can't be being trafficked. One of the last ops that we did when we were still working for the state was in Colombia, and this lady showed up to meet with our undercover officer, and she was married, and her husband was trafficking her and had been for years. And the husband showed up a little bit, I don't know, 15 or 20 minutes after she arrived at the hotel parking lot with the kids in the car. 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, I think, was their ages. And he's showing up to check on her to make sure that she showed up, to make sure that she was doing what she was supposed to do, to make sure that she was making money. So you can't get caught up in the idea of, well, this is her husband. Well, yeah, but maybe she's being trafficked by him, or it's her husband, or her boyfriend, or her fiance, or whatever. So you will see that. The crown is a big deal. The crown with a name under it. In the bottom right over here, you'll see the crown with the initials. Really popular, especially in the gang communities, to see the trafficker's street name, not their actual real name, but their actual street name or their initials. And again, that's a way, as Megan just said, to let all the other traffickers know that this is my girl, this is my property over here. Because they constantly steal each other's girls, right?
Yes, they do.
They constantly are trying to steal each other's girls. There's violence that they do toward each other to steal each other's girls. There was a homicide several years ago in Springfield where four people were killed in a hotel room, and it was all over girls. It was pimps stealing each other's girls, and there were 4 people killed in that hotel room, and that's what it was over. So seeing the crown is a big deal. Upper right there, you see the crown, and then underneath that it says King Munch. That is the trafficker's name. That's the street name, his gang name, right under the crown, and they put it right there on the neck because they want everyone to see that's my girl, that's my property. I'm the one in charge, and this is my property. So basically, stay away. Don't try to steal my girl. This is how I'm making money. Anything to add to that?
You're right.
Sometimes we will see barcodes. These are significantly more rare than what you'll see like in The Crown or maybe Daddy's Girl or something like that. But every now and then you'll see a barcode. The neck is a good place to see a barcode. I've seen them on wrist. I've seen them on arms, things like that. And sometimes what they'll even do is they'll put that little number on there. And unbelievably, there's actually a place that you can go online and you can put that little number in, and you can basically say, this is my property and this is my girl with this number on it. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but sometimes they do. It's just, I think, just a total control thing that they can say, you are basically my property, right? But they do that. Sometimes they're actually dumb enough that they'll actually just put their actual name on there and say property of whatever, John Smith or whatever their name is. I mean, for law enforcement, we love it when they do that. Sometimes they'll continue to use their gang name or their street name. That's way more common, way more popular. But every now and then, if they want to actually put their real name on there, okay, law enforcement, we love that, right? We like the dumb ones better than the smarter ones because they're easier to catch. But sometimes they'll do that. They'll just put their actual name on there. So that is something that you look for. If you're in the community, you're a police officer or whatever, and you see something that says property of whatever, is that a clue? Of course, that's a clue, right? I doubt anybody, I hope nobody sitting in the audience has like property of somebody tattooed on them. But that would be a clue that we'd be looking for. Here's some other ones. These are street names. By any means necessary is another one. You'll see loyalty sometimes on there as well, which was that first tattoo we looked at. More things like that involved in gangs. And unfortunately, this whole pimping lifestyle, so on this bottom left, anybody recognize this particular character? Who is that?
Ice-T.
It's Ice-T, yeah. And how do we know Ice-T? Because he's a rapper, but more importantly, I think most people know Ice-T. We're going to get some more tattoos in a minute, Megan, so don't run off too far, okay? But most people know Ice-T from where? From Law and Order Special Victims, right? Where he was a detective that was out, doing special victims work as a detective. How many of you know that Ice-T actually created a book and a DVD about how to be a pimp? Besides Megan, anybody else know that? Well, Allison too, but is that kind of a little bit hypocritical? Here I am on TV portraying myself as this Law and Order Special Victims Unit, and I'm going to be out here helping, victims, but yet on the side I'm making a DVD and writing a book about how to be a pimp. Strange days that we live in, right? So there's different kinds of pimps. There is a guerrilla pimp. Megan, what's a gorilla pimp?
A gorilla pimp is the most fierce, dangerous one. He's the one that beats, tortures, and so on.
Yeah, so they're the most violent, and that's where the term gorilla pimp comes from. You know, when Allison talked about force, fraud, and coercion, obviously, the gorilla pimp is using what? He's using force. That's what he's doing. He's using assaults, he's using injuries, he's using fear to get that person to do exactly what he wants to do, right? And then we also have a Romeo pimp. And what does a Romeo pimp do, Megan?
A Romeo pimp is suave, really sweet, really nice, does not hit girls, but will use other ways to discipline them, make them make more extra money, and not feed them.
Yeah, and also do things like depending on where they work, right?
Yes.
So there's kind of a hierarchy as to where the pimp is going to allow the girls to work, right? So that one of the most safer, I don't want to say any of them are safe because they're clearly not, but maybe if you're in good graces and you're bringing in the right amount of money and your pimp's not angry with you, then he lets you work out of maybe hotels and you're working online, right? And maybe he's even trying to vet some of the people that you're going to see. But if you get in trouble, he maybe sticks you at a truck stop, right?
Yes.
And that's kind of like a punishment deal. Or he sticks you out on the street, on the blade, on the boulevard, on the avenue, whatever you call it, right? And here in Kansas City, that's Independence Avenue generally is what most people think of, right? So you get in trouble, you're not bringing in enough money, you're not doing what you're supposed to do, and he says, fine, you need to go work the boulevard today. And out you go on Independence Avenue. If you're in good graces, you're bringing in your quota, your trap for the day, then maybe he says, okay, I'm going to let you go back to meeting clients at hotels online. So a Romeo pimp will do that kind of stuff, right? Then there's CEO pimps. They treat their endeavors as a business. They may or may not bring in elements to the other two types of pimps. Really, all of these pimps have a CEO part to them. Because what is the pimp's ultimate motivation? It's money. It's all about money. And it can be a lot of money. So nationwide, when we're talking about how much money an individual girl is worth to a pimp in 1 year, 12 months, how many of you have any idea how much money that is? Anybody? I heard 6 figures. I heard, Joy, was that you? Joy said 100,000. Is that what you said? Yeah, it's about $200,000. So it's $200,000 for a girl for 12 months. So think about that for a minute. I got 5 girls. I got $1 million. $1 million. Tax-free, yeah, because they're not paying taxes on that, regardless of what Joe Biden says they're not, right? So that's $1 million tax-free. It's a lot of money. Allison and I were fortunate enough to teach up in Nebraska, and after we were teaching the troopers and some people up in Nebraska, and one of the troopers ended up stopping a car and finding an 18-year-old girl in this car with this older gentleman, and by doing some really good police work, they figured out that she was a victim of trafficking. And when they started downloading information off of the phones and things like that, one of the places that he was trafficking her was on OnlyFans. How many of you ever heard of OnlyFans? Anybody? Got really super popular during COVID, right? So he was trafficking her on OnlyFans, and the money was all being run through the trafficker's OnlyFans account, right? So she had an OnlyFans account that he was in charge of, and then he was moving that money into another account, right? Nebraska found $1.2 million in the OnlyFans account. That's how much money he's making off of an 18-year-old girl. Lots and lots of money involved. All right, force, fraud, and coercion. All pimps use variations of these tactics. They're physical, sexual abuse, mental abuse, control of money and identification. They exploit their vulnerabilities and insecurities, purposefully impregnating victims to control the child. I mean, think about how much control you have over someone if you're a trafficker and you have a child with them. right? Unbelievably, in Missouri, in Kansas, and most states, if I'm a trafficker and I impregnate someone who I am trafficking, right? Until I get convicted of trafficking, I get rights to that child. So if it was Megan and I, Megan would, even if she got away from me and was getting services and, you know, she was getting sober and going through all the healing process, right? She would still have to allow me to have access to that child, even though I had trafficked her, because we have this child together. How much control is that? Even when she breaks away, he still has some control until he gets trafficked, or until he gets convicted of trafficking, if he gets convicted of trafficking. And sometimes those cases take years to adjudicate because the criminal justice system works very slowly. So it may be 3 or 4 years. And here's Megan. We have to transport visitation and work out all that stuff. And she's having to do that with the very person that was trafficking her. So that's a tremendous amount of control that they have. So sometimes they'll do that. They're obviously all over the vulnerabilities, because these traffickers are masters at seeing those vulnerabilities. They are masters at picking up on those things. They are masters of manipulation. That's what they do. That's how they get these folks. You know, in the old days, when I was young, I was always taught stranger danger, right? For the older folks that are here and listening online, stranger danger. And that was like, you know, you're taught like, it's a white van that pulls up, and it's like a guy with like a long ponytail, and he's got like 3 teeth in his face, and, you know, a bunch of tattoos, and he comes up to you and he says, hey, you want to see my puppy, and would you like a piece of candy? And you're told what? Stay away, whoa, stranger danger, right? Where's stranger danger at now? It's in our house every day, on a computer and on a phone. Allison talked about it. We let the creepy guy in the van come into our kids, our grandkids, our nieces, our nephews every single day. That's where these traffickers are. They're not driving through the neighborhood in a white van with a puppy anymore. They're coming through your phone. They're coming through the laptop. They're coming through the gaming system. And they're talking to your kids every day, and if you don't think they are, you're sadly mistaken. Your kids just aren't telling you that they're getting bombarded by these traffickers trying to recruit them and trying to groom them every single day. Because at some point, all of our kids nowadays will put stuff on social media that there is no way they should be putting out there. No way. Because let's say they don't do well in school, and then you get on to them about, you need to start studying more. What do? They get on social media and say, my mom, I hate her. She's making me study more. She won't let me go to the party this Saturday because I didn't do well in school, right? Or you take their phone away for a couple days, or whatever you do, you know? In the old days, when I was growing up, we didn't even have the internet, so it didn't matter. And you get mad, you just get mad and you move on. Now they spill their guts online. Some trafficker sees that because that's what they're looking for, and they're like, great. Allison is mad at her mom right now. This is a great opportunity for me to get in there and say, well, Allison, I wouldn't treat you that way. I wouldn't do that to you. If you're with me, I would take care of you. I'd let you do whatever you wanted. Right? Happens very, very quickly. What do you think the average time frame is from when someone starts to be groomed online to when they either meet the person live, face-to-face, or run away? That's excellent. He said a week. It's 8 days. So somebody meets your kid, meets your grandchild, meets your niece, meets your nephew online, starts talking to them, starts grooming them. Within about 8 days, they could possibly be meeting somebody. And we know from research that as many as a third of our kids in high school have admitted to meeting a stranger that they met online in person and didn't tell their parents. A third. A third of all of our high school kids met some stranger that they met online in person. Please tell me that terrifies every parent out here. It's terrifying, right? Okay, some more tattoos. The traffickers themselves will have specific tattoos that are different than what the victims will have. So the victims will have certain kinds of tattoos, and the traffickers will have different kinds of tattoos, right? So most of the trafficking tattoos have something to do with money. So maybe a skull with money. Here you got a money bag with a dollar sign there, and the little money bag is like flipping the bird, right? F you pay me is another one that we'll see from time to time, right? It's all about money. It's Fortune 500. Everything's about money. It's got to be about money. Doing it for the money, making the money. It's all about money, right? MOB, which is again about money. You see the dollar signs. And what is this? Money over bitches. Again, it's all about the money. That's all they care about. That's all their motivation. These women, these men, whoever they're trafficking, and we say women most of the time because that generally is what we see, but there's men too. And I think Allison talked earlier about the LGBTQ community. They're very, very vulnerable because they got a lot of stuff going on, right? They got a lot of vulnerabilities, a lot of confusion, there's a lot of whatever going on there. They start putting that out there online, and then they have these traffickers that pick up on that. Plus, I did not know this until a few years ago, and we had a case up in northeast Missouri in a very rural part of the state. This was an 11-year-old who was a girl but wanted to be a boy, very, very rural part of the state. She was throwing all this out online about how she was having all these issues. Somebody started grooming, and eventually came to Missouri to pick this child up. She was 11, by the way, and take her to Boston. And fortunately, we were able to intervene, and we arrested the person, and they went to jail, and they're still there now. But when we were talking to law enforcement out in Boston, this was the part I didn't know, that an LGBTQ child like that, like 11, is worth double or triple what a regular kid is worth in Boston or New York. Huge amounts of money. They can charge double or triple. So they literally get online and look for vulnerable kids in that state because they can make so much money from them. So MOB, very common amongst the gangsters to have that. And then we have predators, right? And why do we even talk about predators? Because they're not traffickers. What is the predator's motivation? It's not money. What is it? Sexual gratification. That's what it is, right? But why are the predators important in this whole scenario that we're talking about today? Is a victim and become trafficked and then become trafficked. 100% correct. So what she said was that the predators prey on children, which thus creates trauma and vulnerabilities and all this stuff. And then later, these traffickers pick up on that and use that, right? And then recruit and groom and get them involved in trafficking. It's 100% correct. I personally, and Allison too, between the two of us, we got over 20 some years of doing human trafficking work. And I personally, and I know Allison told you earlier the same, I have never interviewed a trafficking victim that was not either a victim of physical abuse or sexual abuse, mostly sexual abuse as a child. It's the same story almost every single time. Most of the time it's sexual abuse, sometimes it's physical abuse, but the same exact story is bad place to be as a child, bad things happened, trauma happened, and then I went down a bunch of really horrible places and a bunch of bad paths, right? And it can happen. I know we talked a lot about, Allison was talking about homeless community and different funnel points and all the people that have these vulnerabilities because they're from broken homes or they're in poverty and things like that. But I've seen plenty of human trafficking victims that are from wealthy families and from upper middle class families. Why? Yes, they have vulnerabilities too. I saw a girl one time whose family was quite wealthy, and she had all kinds of vulnerabilities because mom and dad never spent any time with her. They were too busy working, had really big important jobs, making tons of money, living in a big nice house. She spent more time with the nanny than she did anybody else, and she had all kinds of vulnerabilities. And consequently, she got groomed and then eventually trafficked. So it can be rich kids as well as poor kids, and it can be, and it completely doesn't matter as far as race or anything like that. It's white kids, Asian kids, black kids, Latino kids. None of that matters whatsoever. It's all about the vulnerabilities, and it generally starts with them being a child. So predators have specific tattoos that you'll see on them as well, right? So anybody ever seen a pedo bear? The little bear we have up here? Anybody ever heard of a pedo bear? Basically, pedo bear was created in Japan by pedophiles, basically. Folks that are sexually attracted to children. And it's kind of like when people get tattoos and get things on their bodies, if it's something that they voluntarily do because it's important to them, right? So maybe they were in the military and they want to talk about, their assignment overseas in Iraq or Afghanistan, and they get their unit tattooed on them, right? Or they were an athlete and they get, their college or, whatever, tattooed on them. So we get things tattooed on us that's important to us. Well, in their world, that's important to them. So they're basically putting these pedo bear tattoos, and sometimes it won't be a tattoo. I've seen plenty of pedo bears hanging off the rearview mirrors of cars. I've seen them hanging off the rear bumpers of cars. It's kind of like an advertisement, right? Like somebody would put, like in the drug world, they'll put a marijuana leaf on their shoulder on a tattoo because that's important to them, right? So a pedo bear is basically just them advertising that I'm sexually attracted to children. That's what they're doing, right? And then they'll put other tattoos on themselves, right? So you see the tattoos, I know that they may be hard to see, but you'll see the tattoos where you have an adult female, right? She's got arrow glass hips, and she's got mature breasts, and the whole mature female body with a little child's face or a juvenile's face. Usually like with pigtails and maybe a sucker in their hand, right? So you've got the kid's face with a mature female's body represented, right? And we would refer to that as a pseudo-child. And we see those on folks that are sexually attracted to children, okay? So those are really good indicators if you see something like that to go, whoa, what's that tattoo, right? For law enforcement, it's super important. You come across something like that on a call or something, you see that, is that something that you go, I've seen that before and I kind of know what that means. Does that mean you want to maybe ask a few more questions or start poking around a little bit more? Of course. But even if you're a member of the community, right? So we did some training like this at tattoo businesses. And I remember my lieutenant at the time was like, oh, that's going to be a complete waste of time. The tattoo businesses are not going to like the police. They're not going to cooperate with you. And I'm like, well, I'm going to give it a try. So I went to like 26 tattoo businesses, right? And of the 26, 25 were like, yeah, we've seen that stuff. And yeah, we have kids too. We'll call you when we see that kind of stuff. Only one of them didn't want to be friendly. And while I'm talking to them, they're all sleeved out and got all kinds of tattoos on their arms, and And I'm talking to the guy, and he's being very, very unfriendly to me. And as I look down on his arm, I see, what do I see? I see one of these tattoos. So I ask him about it, and he gets really, really upset with me and throws me out of the tattoo business, right? And I'm not even back to my office yet, and my lieutenant calls, and he's like, hey, what are you doing? I go, just headed back to the office, Lieutenant. What's going on? Were you by chance at any tattoo businesses today? Why, Lieutenant, why would you ask? Well, this one guy called and complained, right? So we check on him, and you know what we found out? He's a registered sex offender and had went to prison for molesting kids. No wonder he was so unfriendly to me, right? So sometimes it's just about paying attention to small little things and what we see. And after we did that little program, it wasn't maybe 2 or 3 weeks, I get a call from one of these tattoo businesses, and she calls me and she goes, hey, I think I got something for you. And I'm like, what do you got? And she's like, well, we had I think she was 15-year-old girl that came in to get a piercing in a place that's very private. And they're not allowed to do that on a 15-year-old without parental consent. So they told her that, and she says, well, my stepdad's in the car, I'll get him to come in. So the stepdad comes in and says, yeah, okay, it's all good. And I'm like, okay, so what is it that you find weird? And they're like, well, we're pretty certain that he's probably not her stepdad. And I'm like, okay, well, what makes you think he's not her stepdad? And they're like, probably because they were making out in the parking lot. Gotcha. We'll send somebody right over there. Is that important for us to know? Yeah. You got a 40-something-year-old guy that's making out with a 15-year-old girl in a parking lot and saying that he's the stepdad and allowing her to come in and get her genitals pierced. That's something we want to know, right? Because that should not be happening. So these predators will have specific tattoos as well. What are some other indicators of exploitation that you might see, whether you're in the law enforcement community or not? And that is like multiple hotel keys, maybe unrelated children, lots and lots of condoms or lubrication, mouthwash in a purse, a lot of mouthwash like that. Multiple cell phones is really, really common for us to see, maybe a victim that's got 2 or 3 cell phones, right? Because she's using them to, send all these ads out there and respond to all these ads. Contacts in the phone, like we talked about daddy and things like that. We'll see very little in the regard of personal belongings. Usually what I have seen is maybe like one of those like shoulder bags, and that's it. Did you ever have more than that? I mean, like a little shoulder bag with like maybe a couple outfits and yeah. I mean, that's what she had. It's not like they're dragging around luggage, right? It's like a shoulder bag and that's it. We'll see like lots of sex toys and sexual paraphernalia, large sums of U.S. currency or lots and lots of gift cards, signs of frequent travel, so like all kinds of receipts and things like that. Again, abrasions, bruising, no personal ID or documents. That's very common for us to be able to or not be able to say that they have any kind of ID. So you ask her where her ID is, and she looks to him. Or she says, I don't have any ID. Well, where is your ID, right? Everybody has ID, okay? Everybody does, regardless of what you hear in the news, everybody has ID. So if they don't have ID, then you should be questioning, why do you not have ID? Where is your ID? The girls that are working in the IMBs, they almost always have passports. They're usually Chinese passports, and we find those in safe deposit boxes a lot because the mama-sons, the gals that are running the massage businesses, they'll store money in safe deposit boxes, and they'll store the passports in the safe deposit boxes. And why do they do that? It's a control thing. Where are these girls going to go in these illicit massage businesses when they come over here from China, They don't speak language. Allison talked about they owe this big debt, $10,000 or more to Chinese organized crime, the snakeheads, right? And they don't speak English. They don't trust the police. And why don't they trust the police? Because where they come from, the police are not very nice. The police in China show up and talk to you, and then you disappear and no one ever sees you again, right? You end up in some concentration camp re-education camp. So they don't like the police. They don't trust the police. So they can't speak English. They owe a giant debt. They don't trust the police. They don't have any ID. They don't have their passport. Where are they supposed to go? What are they supposed to do to get away? The answer is they're just kind of stuck, right? So we see that a lot where they'll take they'll hold their IDs and all that kind of stuff. We're going to push through this a little. We're done at 12, right? Okay. Indicators on phones. Text messages are really, really important. Photos, social media accounts. What are they? What are they used for? Those are really, really important. So we'll see like text messages, many phones that I've looked through over the years. You'll see there'll be 50, 60 guys talking to this girl in text messages. And they're asking all kinds of obviously lewd things and how much it's going to cost and things of that nature. That's an easy telltale sign, right? If she's just getting tons and tons and tons of text messages, or there's all kinds of photos on her phone, selfies like in places like hotel rooms or in front of hotels and things of that nature. That's really, really common for us to see. And then on the traffickers' phones, you'll see, a lot of times you won't see the traffickers, especially the smarter ones. You won't see anything on their phone as far as them setting up the dates or things of that nature. You may see text messages to the girl every now and then telling her where to go and what to do or things like that. But most of the time, they'll set it up so that the girls are the ones placing all the ads. They'll set it up so that the girls are the ones that are having the contact with the Johns. And why are they doing that? So they can say, that's not me, that's her doing that all on her own. When the police start questioning him, that's not me, that's her. She's doing it all on her own, man. I had nothing to do with any of that. You don't see any of that on my phone, right? But if she doesn't do it, what happens to her? She gets a beat down. And after you get beat up a couple times, what do? You set up the ads on your phone, right? You respond to the Johns. That's just what it is. So you'll see that kind of stuff. But what you will see a lot of times on the traffickers' phones, and again, it's crazy that they do this, but they do this. You'll see them like laying on a bed in a hotel room with like all this money around them, and they're laying it like half naked or something. Or I've seen them where they'll have like this giant wad of money, stacked, money, like 6 inches thick of money, and they're like going, and they're biting it, or they're showing it off or whatever. They're showing off how much money they're making. It's such an ego thing, and they just can't help it. So you'll see that on their phones. If you're law enforcement, when you search their phones, you're like, well, look at this guy. Look at what he's doing, right? So you'll see that kind of stuff. What are some other risk factors? We talked about history of victimization. Involvement in the commercial sex industry is obviously a big one. History of running away, history of contact with social services or the foster care system, online activity. One of the examples that I like to use when it comes to these girls is, and I'm going to give you 2 scenarios here, because we're all guilty of this. Everybody, whether you're a police officer, someone in the community, we're all guilty of this, right? Scenario number 1 is a 7-year-old girl who gets molested by her uncle. Between 7 and 10, she gets molested, right? So she's got all this trauma. She's got all these vulnerabilities that she's dealing with. And we all deal with this differently. We all deal with this stuff, in different ways because we're all different people, right? So her way of dealing with it is she doesn't tell anybody, right? And she just kind of keeps it inside, but she's still able to get through school. She doesn't have very many friends, and she's kind of a recluse, but she still gets through school, She gets through high school, right? And after high school, she gets like a secretary job. She still doesn't have any friends, really. She can't hold any kind of a relationship, right? She has a little bit of a hard time dealing with her coworkers, and she drinks a little bit more than she should for sure. But that's really all we see. And then all of a sudden, she's like 25, and she realizes, man, I'm kind of a mess. I'm holding my job, but I'm barely holding my job. I'm drinking way too much. I got to do something. So she joins her local church, and she starts talking to people in the church, and at some point she discloses what happened to her as a child. And the local church helps her, and she starts seeing a counselor, and she starts talking to her pastor, and eventually she starts working through the process, and she heals, or starts to heal, and then she reports it to law enforcement, and law enforcement gets involved, and they go back and start opening up an investigation, and they ultimately end up arresting the uncle for molesting her when she was a child. Okay? So you with me so far? Scenario number 2, different girl. She also gets molested by her uncle from the time that she's 7 until she's 10. Same exact thing, right? She handles it a little bit differently. She still doesn't tell anybody, but she has many more problems than what the first girl had. She starts drinking at an early teenage age. Then she starts using drugs. Then she starts hanging out with older guys, and she becomes that girl, right? Everybody thinks she's just promiscuous. She's the troublemaker. She starts running away from home, right? She starts cutting herself. She starts cutting her wrist. So she's a cutter. She's running away. She's promiscuous. She's that girl, hanging out with older guys. She quits high school and leaves and runs off with an older guy. And the next thing you know, he's trafficking her at hotels and casinos and truck stops and all kinds of places, right? And now she's addicted to drugs. She's addicted to alcohol. She's got all kinds of health problems that is associated with being in a lifestyle. She's getting beat up all the time. She gets arrested multiple times. And she never discloses. And when we see her on Independence Avenue, whether we're the police or we're driving to work or we're just driving through that area and we see her on the corner and she looks really, really, really rough and she looks like she's strung out on drugs, what do we say? Wow, she's rough. She got that hooker over there on the corner. What's the difference between the two? Is there a difference? One, we talked about how brave she is that she came forward and told her story and everything that happened to her. And the other girl is a hooker on the corner. But what's the difference? The only difference is one of them handled it a little bit differently and got themselves in a little bit more of a bad situation. Neither one of them asked for it. They were children when it started. And they were traumatized. And they both have PTSD. And they both went through all this stuff. And they both need healing. And they both need help. They both need law enforcement or the community or somebody to intervene and help them. The church. There's no difference. But yet we treat them differently and we look at them differently. And I did too. Back in the late 90s, I would have arrested her. But there's no difference. They were both kids when it started, and they just need our help. Okay, so we're rescuing. Now we're in the rescue intervention part. And as Allison talked earlier, that's kind of a law enforcement part, right? That's what you're mostly going to see. Now, are there volunteer groups and NGOs and other people that are going out and trying to rescue these girls? They are, and that's great, and they're doing great work. But law enforcement is coming into contact with these victims every single day. They just generally don't know it. And where are they coming into contact with these victims at? Domestic violence calls, overdoses, attempted suicides, girls working on the boulevard, right? The list goes on and on and on. A drug charge, a shoplifting charge. Law enforcement is coming into contact with these girls every single day. The lady that was married that we talked about earlier, right? Local PD had been to her house 4 times for domestic violence. What was the domestic violence over? She didn't want to go work. Husband said, you're going to go out and work. You're going to bring in some money. And when she didn't want to, he beat the tar out of her. And law enforcement never picked up on it and never asked any questions about whether or not she was being trafficked because they didn't know what to look for. They just thought this is domestic violence. So they arrested the husband. He's out of jail the very next morning. And the wheel goes on. And the wheel goes on. So we have to train law enforcement because that's really the foundation of the whole thing. We have to train law enforcement what to look for and how to handle these situations so that we know how to rescue and we know how to intervene and we know how to do this stuff. And it all starts with training, right? So we're really super psyched that Monday we'll be training over at the KCPD Academy, training KCPD and a bunch of other local law enforcement officers. And there's all these other trainings that we're doing. We're doing 4 here at the KCPD Academy over the next 3 months. October, November, February, and March. And then we're doing one over in Topeka. We're doing some in St. Louis. And we're doing them all over the country. We've got 5 in Arkansas. And we're doing like 3 in Idaho. And we're going to Oklahoma and Florida and a variety of different places. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. The key is to get law enforcement trained. That's the key. Because that's the foundation. And while this training is taking place, we want to create this paradigm shift. Well, what is the paradigm shift? The paradigm shift is exactly the story I just told you of the 2 girls. That these are victims. That these are not criminals. They're not quote-unquote prostitutes or hookers or skanks or lot lizards or whatever other terminology that you want to use. They are actually victims. Because they are. Allison told you 99% of them are victims. Right? We just have never seen them in that way. So our goal is to help them recognize that they're victims and intervene and rescue them. Get them services, get them healing. Right? That's our number 1 first goal. And then our second goal is to try to find that trafficker and get them basically arrested and put out of commission. So the research is all pretty much clear. The average age that most people get into the commercial sex industry is between 11 and 14 years of age. Megan was 17, which is actually a little bit older than what the average is, but 11 to 14 is the average across the country, which think about that. Think about what you were like when you were 11 or 12, right? The only thing I knew at 11 or 12 was my dog, football, baseball, and my bike. Right? Think about how innocent you are at 11 or 12. And yet the average age is 11 to 14. Most prostitutes are controlled by some type of a trafficker, some kind of a pimp. The research is, again, all pretty consistent that about 1% of the girls supposedly say they want to be there. I even have a hard time believing that. I mean, what girl grows up and, I don't know, she's 15, 14, 16 and goes, you know, man, I just can't wait until I'm 18 when I can become a prostitute. That'll be so great. I can perform sex on strangers all day. I can get addicted to drugs and alcohol. I can get beat up sometimes. I can get robbed. I can get cut with a box cutter. All these great things can happen. I just can't wait for that to happen. Nobody does that. I don't even know where the 1% is. I've never seen the 1%. Allison's never seen the 1%.
I want to ask Megan a question. So, during the years that you were trafficked, the outsider looking in who wasn't trained thought that's what was happening with you, right? Speak to that.
What was it like when I would get stopped by law enforcement?
Well, I think the perception was that you were a prostitute. It wasn't.
That I was being forced to do what I didn't want to do, but from an outsider's point of view, when they would look at me when they pulling up on corners, thinking that I liked doing what I was doing, standing out there, but didn't know that I was forced to do what I was doing and had nowhere to go and had nobody to call because he had all my documents.
So in the training, one of the first things that we want to talk about is taking this victim-centered approach, this victim-centered model. And I'm sure some of you have heard about what that is. And it's been around for several years. And basically, it is basically doing what is best for the victim and not treating them as though they are the criminal, recognizing that they are the victim, and doing what is best for them. Not re-traumatizing them, not putting them, arresting them, doing all those kinds of things. It's kind of working backwards, which is recognizing that they were probably some type of a victim as a child, and that's what started this whole thing, and trying to get them out of this situation, helping them, rescuing them, and getting them to a situation that can be healed, right? So what we did with the victim, quote-unquote, victim-centered approach is we decided to build upon that. So we built something called the Special Victims Methodology, and it is kind of like the victim-centered approach on steroids, right? So it's a complete paradigm shift for law enforcement, and it's finicky for law enforcement to hear this at first, but it's proven to be successful across in other places in the country. And basically what it does is it gets law enforcement away from just arrest, right? Because a lot of times law enforcement figures our success based upon arrest, right? If we're arresting a whole bunch of people, then we're being successful because we're stopping crime. And there's some truth to that. There 100% is. But in other instances, I'm not sure that's the best approach. When it comes to these girls, I think clearly that's not the best approach. So the best approach through the Special Victims Methodology is to say, our number one goal, is to take these girls out of this lifestyle and remove them and rescue them. And if we don't do anything else, that's a victory. That's a victory, okay? Now, one of the problems with trafficking cases is if you look at the stats across the country, about 7 to 10% of these girls will disclose. Most of them are not going to disclose, right? Because they're trauma bonded to their trafficker, they're suffering from PTSD, they don't trust the police because their trafficker's been telling them for years and years and years and brainwashing them how bad the police are and they're not going to help you. And honestly, we have not always been very nice to these girls because we've arrested them most of the time. And almost all of the victims that I've interviewed, and it's been hundreds, will tell you I had 14, 15, 16, 18, 20 contacts with law enforcement, and you know what? They were pretty much all bad. So we're our own worst enemy. How many contacts did you have with law enforcement?
A lot.
Give me a guess. 50? 40?
About probably over 50 times.
Okay. How many of those were positive experiences with law enforcement?
None.
There you go. There you go. So we are our own worst enemy when it comes to how we have handled these victims in the past. Okay? So our goal with the Special Victims Methodology is to create this mindset change, to intervene, to rescue the victims, right? And then what we found is we found a completely different way to interview them. Completely different. That takes that 7 to 10% and bumps it to about 60%. So now you're doing this Special Victims Methodology interview, and now you're getting these victims to tell you in a really, really victim-centered way and approach that they're being trafficked and who their trafficker is, which enables us to have much better prosecution. So it's really kind of an oxymoron in some respects, because law enforcement thinks arrest, right? And then that's going to help us arrest the trafficker once we arrest the girls, and that's not what happened. We've seen that for 100 years. But when we rescue the girls, that's when we end up getting more prosecution on the backside, after we treat them completely differently and after we do it completely differently, right? So it's a completely different approach that has been successful in places across the country, right? So tell me what you see when you see this photo. If you saw this young lady, what would you think? I love that. He said, I'm thinking she could probably beat me up. Right? I mean, we would probably look at her and go, huh, she's a little rough looking, right? She's got some tattoos on her face and different things, right? Yeah, she looks hard. She looks like she's been through a lot in her life, right? We probably would if she was walking down the sidewalk, would we maybe cross the street and go somewhere else? Would we maybe walk away from her? Would we say hello to her? Would we want to have contact with her? I don't know. Maybe some of you would. Maybe some of you wouldn't. But what if I told you that that's this little girl? Right? And what happened to her is she suffered all kinds of tremendous abuse as a child. Right? She's got a horrible story. Basically, which this is actually very rare, but she was actually abducted along with her little brother, who was a year older than her. She was 7 and he was 8, I think. Her parents were killed by her abductor. They were then taken to a cabin in Montana where they were sexually abused. She then watched her abductor kill her brother in front of her, and he continued to sexually abuse her and threatened her that if she tried to leave, he'd kill her. And here she is with her missing persons thing on a billboard where they're trying to find her. And here she is going into a convenience store with her abductor. Now, if you saw that little girl walking, what is something that you would say right away? Does she look happy? Her posture is pretty closed, right? Now, does that mean that this may not be her father, and that maybe they're going to grandmother's house for lunch or for dinner, and she wants a donut, and he says no, and now she's throwing a temper tantrum? How many of you have had that happen with your kid? All of us, right? And now she's all pissy? That could be that. But in this case, it wasn't. And she walked through this whole convenience store, and there's a whole bunch of photos that you can see. All of them are online. And nobody said a word until they leave the convenience store and they go to a Denny's. And the waitress at Denny's goes, something's not right. I don't know what it is, but something's not right. She calls the police. The police show up. They rescue her. Arrest the abductor. She was gone 46 days or something like that. You know the old saying, if you see something, say something? Remember we started hearing that really, really a lot after 9/11? It's no different for this. We would rather you call law enforcement 20 straight times and be wrong, because the 21st time you may rescue somebody. If you see something, say something, right? All right, we're about running out of time, so I'm going to go really fast. There's lots of ways that victims are controlled, and we talked about many of them, obviously already today. And this is like a shot of basically the difference in the temporal lobes of how trauma affects people. Okay? So we know that they're affected in all these different ways that create PTSD, create trauma bonding, create all these things that make these victims basically brainwashed and not want to talk to the police, right?
I'll tell the story behind this picture here. That's kind of an example of how trauma impacts the brain in a moment of trauma. Some of you might recognize this was the Miracle on the Hudson. This happened in 2009. this aircraft was taking off out of New York. It flew through a flock of geese. Both engines went out, and they were over a major metropolitan area having to make a decision of where to put down. They weren't able to come back to the airport. So the captain made the very courageous decision to land on the Hudson. And so I'm sure in all of that, I don't know how many passengers were on that plane, probably all thought they were going to die, right? Very traumatic moment for all of those people. They miraculously safely landed on the river. The flight attendants did a great job, opened all the emergency exits, and got everyone on the wing so that they could be rescued. But what happened in that moment when they first were floating there on the river and they popped the exits, and the flight attendants are telling everybody to get out, to walk towards the exit. Pretty simple instruction, right? Normally, somebody tells me to walk towards the exit right now, I can do that, right? But in that moment, those people, their brains were in a different mode. They were in trauma mode. They weren't in this like logical thinking place. They were in this place, which is where you go in trauma when something terrible is happening. You can't logically think and follow instructions. You can't even follow something as simple as, I just need to walk towards the door. And so what a lot of those people were, they were in fight, flight, or freeze, right? A lot of people were totally frozen. They were standing in the aisle, not moving, in shock, and it actually started becoming a very dangerous type of situation because they needed to get going. And so I think it's just a good example of what happens to your brain when you go through traumatic moments. You're not doing your best logical thinking, and if you go through trauma over and over and over, it can actually do damage to your brain and impair your thinking.
Okay, so obviously, once we identify victims, we want to help them restore, right? And so having NGOs that you could have emergency and non-emergency. Allison talked earlier about the one op that we did where the girl was in really, really bad shape when she showed up. The nurse that we had on site with our victim advocates came to me right away and said, we have a problem. Because we provide on-site medical to all these girls because they all got STDs or UTIs or all kinds of other issues. And she came and she said, we got to get her to the hospital. And I'm like, what's going on? And as it turned out, she was septic and had an infection from one of those female issues, and her trafficker would never let her go to get medical services. And now this infection had spread throughout her body. And fortunately, we ended up catching her in this operation and helping her. But the doctors were like, she would have been dead in 48 hours had there not been an intervention. And think about that. She's sick. Allison said she looked green. She had purple lips because her oxygen level was all deprived. That trafficker was still making her work. He would have continued to work her until she died, and then he would have thrown her in the ditch or a vacant lot and went to the next girl. That's what would have happened to her. But because we were doing that operation, we ended up getting her medical services and helped her, right? There's obviously need for short and long-term care. There's all kinds of domestic issues between the international victims and the domestic victims, and then there's minors and adults. Those are issues that you have to deal with. And they're going to need maybe housing, employment, finances, food, maybe child care, obviously education, health care, life skills, all kinds of social support, all the stuff that Restoration House is doing and all the other NGOs are doing. It's really, really important to get that done. And we really have to all work together to make this stuff happen. Relentless Pursuit, which is down on Independence Avenue and has a drop-in center, which is great, right? And then clearly Restoration House is doing all the stuff, which is where Megan is, and she's helping all the other.
Wait, back up onto that the Restoration House slide. So I have both the websites up there. These are great organizations doing restoration work. Megan is a participant of the program because we're short on time, but I want to give you a few minutes to talk about like ways that volunteers help and serve the women in the program there.
Yes, I know that we need a lot of volunteers for schooling. I got my high school diploma through Wenatchee Valley College, which was in the state of Washington, and they have a High School 21 program from when I was getting help from getting out of my trafficking situation. I was put out in Washington. And with the family I was put with, they put me in that school. And if you're 21 and older, you get to go back for your high school diploma and get it at Washington College in Wenatchee. So they let me finish because of COVID. But because we're in Missouri, they weren't going to let anybody else inside a restoration house. But I was involved in a newspaper article, and I sent my teacher my newspaper article to show her that that the Wenatchee Valley College was in the newspaper. So now, because of that, they're willing to work with Restoration House and work with Missouri to let all the girls that come through Restoration House to get their high school diploma with Washington State. So I know we need a lot of tutors within math and English. I know that we're going to need a lot of overnights because they're about to open up next door with 16 beds. And the one house that we stay in, I will end up becoming the house mom, and we won't have volunteers there, but they will go next door, and that's where 16 girls are going to be at. So I know that we need a lot of volunteers there. I know we need volunteers for yard work. We need volunteers to help set up for the new stuff that's coming in, the kitchen stuff, the living rooms. I know we need people to adopt bedrooms and people to come and help out during the day. And we need drivers because girls are going to start getting jobs. And I take on a lot of driving. I actually work 7 days a week to help out taking girls back and forth to work. I know we need a lot of volunteers for that on the weekends.
Relentless Pursuit, they do outreach on Independence Avenue. They need people to provide meals for their drop-in center, and also they need volunteers there to help serve the women too. So those are great ways to help.
Yeah, and there's lots of things that you can do besides volunteer, because I know volunteer work is not, something in everybody's wheelhouse. Some people are like, man, I really want to help, but I just don't have the right mindset or maybe the personality to do volunteer work. There's nothing wrong with that. You can help in plenty of other ways. You can support a law enforcement training. All the training that we're doing for KCPD has been privately sponsored. You can support a law enforcement training. Maybe you have a certain skill set. Maybe you're a web designer and you can help like with web stuff and computer stuff. Maybe you're an accountant, you can volunteer some services. Maybe you're a lawyer, you can volunteer some services. There's lots of things that you can do to help these nonprofits, to help these girls, to help these survivors, to get out and do lots of different things. So don't think that you only can do volunteer work, because there's tons of other things that you can do, and we'll be happy to talk to you about any of those things. Lastly, we want to leave you with something that we always leave the law enforcement officers with, and that is when we talk to these girls, and I always find this really, really interesting, that they all are very much like Megan, and they'll tell you all these contacts that they had with law enforcement and how most of them were negative. But yet when you ask them, how do you feel about the police? You know what I find really interesting is they always say they're pro-police. They always say they like the police. They want to help the police, right? And I go, why? You've always had bad experiences with the police. And what they almost to a T would tell me is, yes, but most of them were rescued by that one police officer. That one police officer that taught them, treated them like a human being, that was there to help them, that didn't want to just arrest them, but wanted to be there to help them. And maybe tried multiple times, until it was the right time to help that person. And then when they called and said, hey, I need help, that police officer helped them, got them into a shelter, got them into wherever they needed to go to be safe. So it's funny how they have had all these negative experiences, but they like the police because there was that one person that did it, right? So what we tell the police is, you be that one. You be that one that goes and saves somebody. You be that one that's there for them when they need help. You be that one that's checking on them on Independence Avenue. You be that one that's talking to them and not just trying to arrest them, but trying to help them. And it's not just police, it needs to be everybody in the community to be that one. Because if everybody becomes that one, think of all of the victims that we can help and all the rescues that we can help and all the numbers that we can bring, right? So we just want to leave you with you, when you leave here today, just be the one. Be that one. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Dan and Allison and Megan, for sharing your story, your expertise with us today. Again, thank you to those of you who have been watching online and being a part of this with us. This is just the beginning in many ways, not only of this conversation, but of this work in our city. And so I'm so grateful that you guys pointed us to some organizations, some nonprofits who are involved in this work. Those websites are there available. If you have more questions, want to follow up, I know these folks will be around here for a few minutes if you want to chat with them. But again, thank you for taking some time this morning. And since we are in a church, can I just pray over the three of you, just the work that you're doing as we close? I just would love to offer a blessing to that. And this is the kind of work that we believe as the local church that is at the heart of God's love for the world. So let me close by doing that and just pray over you. Father in heaven, we are so grateful for Allison, for Dan, for Megan. We pray that you would empower the work that they're doing. Would you multiply their efforts, and would you use it? Would you just affirm and bless the work of their hands, so that those who are caught in these just unthinkable evil situations would be set free and be restored. And we ask this in your name. Amen. Thank you for being here again, for joining us for this. There's still lots of refreshments there available, so feel free to help yourself to that, and take a moment just to thank Dan, Allison, Megan one more time. Let's thank them.
Now that you saved me, I sing 'cause you gave me a song of revival. I put it on vinyl. Rise up, rise up, rise up, rise up. I once was blinded, but now I see it. I heard about the power, and now I believe it. Oh, rise up, rise up, rise up, rise up. All at once I came alive. This beat and I, these open eyes, the game let go. The darkness should have known. You're still rolling strong. You're still rolling strong. I thought that I was too far gone for everything I've done wrong. Yeah, I'm the one who dug this grave, but you called my name. You called my name. I thought that I was too far gone for everything I've done wrong. Yeah, I'm the one who dug this grave, but you called my name. You called my name. All at once I came alive. This beat and I, these open eyes, the game let go. The darkness should have known. You're still rolling strong. for a living.